Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we're going to explore a story that reminds us how precious our loved ones are, and how quickly life can change. This is a story about a family, a quiet summer day, and a tragedy that would shake an entire nation. Let yourself drift as we unfold this tale. Slowly, carefully, with the respect it deserves. This is the story of the Hunt family murders. Picture Bushey, a peaceful town in Hertfordshire, England. It sits just northwest of London, nestled in rolling countryside with a population of around 28,000 people. Bushey has the feeling of a village, even though it technically became a town long ago. The streets are lined with homes built over generations. Victorian cottages sit beside 1930s, detached houses. Gardens bloom in the summer. Children walk to well-regarded schools. Bushey is the kind of place where neighbors know each other's names, where the annual festival each July brings the community together, where residents shop at independent stores along the high street, grab coffee at local cafes, and feel genuinely safe. The town has a conservation area near St. James Church, with buildings dating back to the 18th century. History lives here, quietly without fanfare. On Ashland Close, in a residential neighborhood, stood a detached house valued at around £800,000. Not a mansion, but comfortable. The kind of home a successful professional might call their own. Inside this house lived the Hunt family. John Hunt was the patriarch. A beloved BBC racing commentator, his voice was familiar to millions who listened to horse racing on Radio 5 Live and Sky Sports. He'd been with the BBC since 2004, describing races with precision and passion. His colleagues called him kind, thoughtful, a mentor. But John was happiest, they said, talking about his Carol and his girls. Carol Hunt was 61 years old. A wife, a mother, the heart of her household. And there were the daughters. Hannah, 28, worked as a beautician, bringing confidence to her clients. Louise, 25, ran a dog grooming business from an outbuilding on the family property. She loved animals, loved caring for them. And there was Amy, the oldest daughter, who would survive what was coming. This was a close family. John adored them. They were, by all accounts, ordinary people living good lives. But someone else knew this family. Someone who had been welcomed into their home. His name was Kyle Marcus Clifford. Born on the 5th of April, 1998 in Enfield, North London. He was 26 years old in the summer of 2024. Clifford had tried to make something of himself. In 2019, at age 21, he joined the British Army. He became a trooper in the Queen's Dragoon Guards, a reconnaissance regiment with a history stretching back to 1685. The Dragoon Guards were specialists, the eyes and ears of the battlefield. It was prestigious work, but Clifford struggled. Former colleagues would later describe him as immature for his age. He had, they said, a chip on his shoulder. He found it difficult to grasp basic military concepts, though he managed to pass training. After serving briefly, he dropped out in 2022. After the military, Clifford worked as a security guard at a fire and security installation company called Amthal. He was employed there from February through July of 2023. Then he left that job too. By July 2024, he was unemployed, at loose ends. There was darkness in his family history. Clifford's older brother, Bradley, was serving 23 years in prison for murder. In 2017, Bradley had gotten into a confrontation outside a bar in Enfield, when a bottle was thrown at his prized red Ford Mustang, damaging the wing mirror. Bradley pursued a moped carrying two young men, He ran them down deliberately, then leapt from his car and beat 18-year-old Soban Khan to death. As the boy lay dying in the road, the attack was relentless, vicious. Bradley Clifford was sentenced in 2018. Kyle Clifford knew what his brother had done. Violence ran in the family. For 18 months, Kyle Clifford was Louise Hunt's boyfriend. He was a regular presence in the Hunt household, visiting often. John Hunt would later say he never once heard raised voices between Kyle and Louise. There were no obvious warning signs, no alarms that anything was wrong. Kyle seemed on the surface like an ordinary young man. But behind closed doors, the relationship was different. Friends would later describe Clifford as controlling. He monitored Louise's life, her choices, her friendships. He didn't want her wearing makeup. He didn't want her talking to other men. He mocked her, ridiculed her. The relationship was turbulent. Louise grew tired of it. By June of 2024, she'd had enough of his views, his behavior, his need to control her. On the 26th of June, Louise ended the relationship. To her relief, Clifford appeared to accept it. He seemed calm about the breakup, but acceptance was a mask. Behind it, something was building. In the days following the breakup, Kyle Clifford went shopping. The purchases were methodical, deliberate. He ordered a 10-inch steel butcher's knife. He purchased a Horizon Cornet MXT 405 compound crossbow, along with 6 bolts. He tried to order a CO2 Glock air pistol, though it wouldn't arrive in time. He bought large quantities of petrol, duct tape, rope. Digital evidence would later show his internet searches during this period. Clifford was planning something. He was gathering the tools he would need. On the 9th of July 2024, he put his plan into motion. It was a Tuesday. Summer in Bushy. The weather was pleasant. John Hunt was working that day, commentating at Lingfield Park Racecourse. Amy was away. Only Carol, Hannah, and Louise were home. Clifford drove to the area in the early afternoon. He parked his car nearby, a black seat, and walked to check the driveway of the Hunt home. He wanted to know whose vehicles were there. He needed to confirm John Hunt was gone. To be certain, Clifford searched online for horse racing events. He looked up John Hunt's schedule, verifying where the commentator would be. Satisfied that John wasn't home, Clifford prepared himself. He concealed the butcher's knife in a rucksack. At 2:32 in the afternoon, he approached the house and rang the doorbell. Carol Hunt answered the door. Clifford told her he was returning some of Louise's belongings. It was a plausible excuse. Carol, always kind. Let him in. The doorbell camera captured their conversation on the doorstep. It would also record sounds from inside the house throughout what followed. Once inside, Clifford attacked Carol with the knife. He stabbed her. Carol, 61 years old, who had shown Clifford nothing but kindness, died from those wounds. Based on the timeline, investigators believe Clifford waited. He waited for Carol to die before leaving the house at 3:07 in the afternoon. He walked back to his car, retrieved the crossbow, and concealed it under a blanket. Then he returned to the house. Louise was working in her dog grooming business, located in an outbuilding at the back of the property. Customers came and went through a side gate during the afternoon. Everything seemed normal. At 4:11 in the afternoon, Louise entered the main house. Shortly after, her screams filled the air. High-pitched screaming. A male voice, shouting, banging noises. Neighbors would later remember these sounds. The terror lasted until 4:26. Clifford restrained Louise. He bound her wrists and ankles with duct tape. He gagged her. Then for hours he subjected her to unimaginable horror. He raped her. He tortured her. This was not a crime of passion or impulse. This was calculated cruelty against a woman who had done nothing more than end a relationship that made her unhappy. At 5:31, Clifford left the house briefly to go to the outbuilding. He took Louise's phone. Using it, he sent a message to John Hunt, asking when he would be home. He searched online to see if unplugging a smoke detector would fully disconnect it. Investigators believe he was planning to burn the house down with evidence inside. Clifford returned to the back garden, then re-entered the house at 6:20. He closed the patio blinds. He was preparing for the final act. At 6:49 in the evening, Hannah Hunt called her mother's phone. She was approaching the house, wondering why Carol hadn't answered. 1 minute later at 6:50, Clifford shot Louise through the back with a crossbow bolt. Louise died almost instantly. Hannah entered the property mere seconds later. She called out to her mother, asking why she hadn't answered the phone. She went upstairs, and she saw him, Kyle Clifford, standing in her family home. Hannah began shouting at him. He tried to calm her down, but Hannah started crying, screaming. At 6:52, Hannah managed to send a message to her boyfriend, Alex Klein. The message said to call the police. It said Kyle Clifford was tying her up. Then her phone was silenced. At 6:54, Clifford shot Hannah with the crossbow. The bolt struck her, a terrible wound, but it didn't kill her immediately. Clifford fled the house, once again concealing the crossbow under a blanket. He walked away from Ashland Close. Based on audio recordings from the doorbell camera, investigators believe Hannah discovered the bodies of her mother and sister at 6:57. She was wounded, dying, surrounded by horror, but Hannah didn't give up. Police who would later investigate called Hannah's actions extraordinary. Officers with 30 years of experience said their breath was taken away by her bravery, by how clearly she was able to think in that moment of absolute terror. Hannah knew what she needed to do. Despite her injuries, despite the trauma, she called 999. She told emergency services what had happened. She identified Kyle Clifford as the killer. She gave police the information they needed. Then Hannah managed to send another message to her boyfriend. She told him what had happened. She told him who was responsible. These actions would save her father's life. Investigators believe Clifford had planned to wait for John Hunt to return home and kill him too. But Hannah's call to emergency services changed everything. Police were on their way. Hannah Hunt died from her injuries before help could arrive. But her final moments were an act of incredible courage. Police arrived at the house on Ashland Close at 7 in the evening. They found Hannah in the main doorway, barely clinging to life. Inside, they discovered the bodies of Carol and Louise. All three women were pronounced dead at the scene. The weapons used, the method of killing, the sheer brutality of it, shocked even veteran officers. This was described as one of the most horrific crime scenes they had encountered. A neighbor's security camera had captured footage of a man leaving the Hunt home carrying a large object under a white sheet. The figure got into a black seat vehicle. John Hunt was still at Lingfield Park, still working. Someone had to tell him. Imagine receiving that news. Your wife, your 2 daughters, all gone, murdered in your own home while you were away doing your job. The devastation, John would later say, could not be put into words. Police immediately began searching for Kyle Clifford. His car was found abandoned. He was considered armed and dangerous, possibly still carrying the crossbow. The public was warned not to approach him. The search focused on the Enfield area, where Clifford lived. Officers raided his home. They searched his brother Bradley's former address. Hours passed with no sign of him. On the 10th of July, the day after the murders, police received reports of a person in Lavender Hill Cemetery in Enfield. About 15 miles from Beshi, armed officers responded. Helicopters circled overhead. An air ambulance landed. They found Kyle Clifford in the cemetery. He had shot himself in the chest with the crossbow. The self-inflicted wound was severe. He was paralyzed from the chest down. Officers took him into custody, recovering the crossbow at the scene. No shots were fired by police. Clifford was taken to the hospital in critical condition. He remained under police guard, but his injuries were so severe that he couldn't be formally arrested until the 11th of July, when he was stable enough to understand the charges. The racing community rallied around John Hunt. At Newmarket's July Festival, jockeys wore black armbands. A minute of silence was held. Tributes poured in from colleagues, from people who had never met John but felt connected to his grief. John Hunt released a statement with his daughter Amy. They said the devastation they were experiencing could not be put into words. They thanked people for their messages of support. They asked for privacy and time to grieve. A fundraising page was started to help the family. Thousands of pounds were raised. The British racing community, tight-knit and supportive, came together, but no amount of support could change what had happened. No words could bring Carol, Hannah, and Louise back. Kyle Clifford was charged with 3 counts of murder. He was charged with the false imprisonment of Louise Hunt, 2 counts of possessing offensive weapons, and later he was charged with 1 count of rape. On the 17th of September, 2024, Clifford appeared remotely at Westminster Magistrates Court. In December, at Cambridge Crown Court, he pleaded not guilty to all charges. The case went to trial on the 3rd of March, 2025. As evidence was presented, the full horror of what Clifford had done became clear. The digital evidence showing his purchases after the breakup, the timeline showing his calculated approach, the doorbell camera recordings, Hannah's messages and 999 call. On the 22nd of January, 2025, Kyle Clifford changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder, guilty to false imprisonment, guilty to possession of offensive weapons, but he pleaded not guilty to the rape charge. That case went before a jury who heard the evidence and found him guilty. On the 11th of March, 2025, Kyle Clifford was sentenced at Cambridge Crown Court. He refused to attend the hearing. This final act of cowardice meant he didn't face John Hunt and Amy in person. Judge Joel Bennett delivered the sentence in Clifford's absence. He described the murders as brutal and cowardly. He said the evidence showed Clifford to be a jealous man, soaked in self-pity, a man who holds women in utter contempt. Letters Clifford had written to his family before the attacks were, the judge said, dripping with self-pity. The judge noted that Louise Hunt had been as gentle as she could in ending the relationship after Clifford's arrogance and anger proved too much for her to stand. Hannah Hunt had done nothing to harm Clifford except support her little sister, and Carol Hunt had shown Clifford nothing but kindness in the moments before he attacked her. Kyle Marcus Clifford was sentenced to a whole life order. He will never be released from prison. He will die behind bars, paralyzed, living with what he did. Almost a year after the murders, in June 2025, John Hunt gave his first television interview. He sat with his daughter Amy and spoke with BBC journalist Victoria Derbyshire. It was a moment of profound courage. John said that from the moment he wakes up, he says good morning to Carol, Hannah, and Louise. He talks to them every day. Sometimes he says out loud to Hannah and Louise that he's sorry he can't be with them because he's with their mom at that moment. As he closes his eyes at night, he chats with them. They are never far from him. John spoke about Hannah's final actions. He said he believes those actions saved his life. Police officers confirmed that Clifford had searched online for John's schedule, suggesting he planned to wait for the commentator to return home. But Hannah's 999 call brought police to the scene immediately. I get to live, John said. Hannah gave me that, and I've got to treat it as a gift from her. When John confronted Clifford in court through his victim impact statement, he wanted to look him in the eye. He told Clifford he was callous, cowardly, and vindictive. He said that hell would roll out the red carpet for what he had done. But John also reflected on how Clifford had deceived them all during his 18-month relationship with Louise. When I challenged myself about how you were able to deceive us all, John said, I simply say that you are a psychopath who, for the duration of your time together with Louise, was able to disguise yourself as an ordinary human being. Amy Hunt echoed this. She said they had absolutely no indication that this man was capable of stabbing their mother, tying Louise up, raping Louise, shooting Louise, and shooting Hannah. The signs, she said, simply weren't there. John still lives in the family home. He returned to work as a racing commentator, first at Brighton in September 2024, chosen because it was the last place he and Carol had spent a weekend together. His colleagues wrapped their arms around him. Racing, his second family, held him up when he needed it most. The Hunt family murders forced a nation to confront uncomfortable questions about domestic violence, about the warning signs that sometimes aren't visible to those closest to the situation, about crossbow laws in the United Kingdom, where these weapons can be purchased without a license. There were calls for legislative change. The case drew comparisons to an incident in December 2021, when an intruder with a crossbow broke into Windsor Castle, intending to kill Queen Elizabeth II. That man, Jaswant Singh Chahal, was later sentenced to 9 years in prison for treason. But beyond policy debates, this case reminds us of something more fundamental. It reminds us that the people we love can be taken from us in an instant, that violence can hide behind a familiar face, that evil doesn't always announce itself. John Hunt's message to the world, shared through his friend Matt Chapman, was simple and profound. You never know when it's going to be the last day you see your family. Make the most of every day because you just don't know. Carol Hunt was 61 years old. A mother, a wife, the center of her family. She welcomed a young man into her home and showed him kindness. That kindness was repaid with violence. Hannah Hunt was 28 years old. A beautician who brought confidence to her clients. In her final moments, wounded and surrounded by horror, she thought not of herself but of protecting her father. Her actions saved his life. Louise Hunt was 25 years old. A dog groomer who loved animals and cared for them with tenderness. She had the courage to end a relationship that wasn't right for her. She deserved to live free from fear, free from violence. Instead, she became the victim of a man who couldn't accept that she had the right to say no. These three women died on the 9th of July, 2024, in their home in Bushey, Hertfordshire. They were murdered by Kyle Clifford, a man who claimed to care for one of them, but proved capable only of destruction. Their memory lives on in John and Amy Hunt, in the racing community that embraced them, in the Hunt Family Fund established to support charities and causes that help and inspire young women, in everyone who heard their story and promised to hold their loved ones a little closer. Let yourself rest now. The story is told. Justice, such as it is, has been served. Kyle Clifford will never walk free, but justice doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't erase the grief. What remains is memory and love, and the precious, fragile nature of the lives we share with those we hold dear. Tonight, I want you to sleep well, but tomorrow, tell the people you love that you love them. Don't wait. Don't assume there will always be time, because as the Hunt family learned on that terrible summer day, time is never guaranteed. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we're going to journey through a case that touched the heart of Michigan. A story of ambition, betrayal, and the fractures hidden beneath a seemingly perfect life. This is the story of Tara Lynn Grant. Let your breathing slow, let your muscles relax, and let me take you back to a different time, a different place, to the suburbs of Detroit in 2007. The story begins not in the suburbs, but in the quiet rural stretches of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. On June 28, 1972, a baby girl named Tara Lynn DeStramp came into the world in Delta County in the small community of Perkins. Her parents, Mary and Gerald, who everyone called Dusty, welcomed their daughter with joy. 3 years later, Tara's sister Alicia arrived, and the two girls would grow up close, bound by sisterhood and the steady rhythms of small-town life. Mary DeStramp was a woman of tradition and faith, keeping a spotless home and working as a dental hygienist. She believed in structure, in cleanliness, in doing things the right way. Gerald, on the other hand, worked at the Sawyer Air Force Base in Gwen as a utility worker, bringing home a steady paycheck that kept the family comfortable, if not wealthy. Together, they created a home where both those could flourish. And flourish Tara did, from an early age. Those who knew her recognized something special in the young girl. Ambitious, they would say, driven. Whatever Tara set her mind to, she achieved. She wasn't one to sit idle or dream without action. If she wanted something, she made it happen. At Mid-Peninsula High School, Tara became known as an exceptional student. She played clarinet in the school band, the notes flowing from her instrument with practiced precision. She played basketball, her competitive spirit driving her down the court. She cheered on the sidelines, her energy infectious. She even earned state awards in 4-H shooting sports, a testament to her focus and steady hand. But more than any single accomplishment, what people remembered about Tara was her determination. She was goal-oriented. They said, a young woman who was going places. Everyone who knew her believed she would do something significant with her life. And they were right. After graduating from Mid-Peninsula High School in 1990, Tara began her college journey at Baydanal Community College in Escanaba. But her ambitions reached beyond the community college's walls. She transferred to Michigan State University, where she pursued a bachelor's degree in business administration with an emphasis on marketing. It was at Michigan State, among the sprawling campus and thousands of students, that Tara's future began to take shape. She graduated in 1995, diploma in hand, ready to step into the professional world, and almost immediately she found her place. Washington Group International, a Boise, Idaho-based engineering and construction firm with offices around the globe, hired the young graduate. Tara started in their downtown Detroit office, and from the very beginning it was clear she possessed something her employers valued. Intelligence, yes, but also work ethic, perfectionism, the ability to rise to any challenge placed before her. Over the next 12 years, Tara climbed the corporate ladder with steady determination. She completed the company's prestigious LEAP program, designed for high-potential employees. She took on roles of increasing responsibility. By 2007, she had achieved the position of operations manager, traveling frequently for business, but always returning to the people she loved most, her family. But let's step back for a moment. Back to the summer of 1994, when Tara was still a student at Michigan State University. It was then that she met a young man named Stephen Christopher Grant. Stephen had been born in January of 1970, also in Michigan, to parents Susan and William, though everyone called William by his nickname, Al. Stephen had an older sister named Kelly, born in 1967. The Grant family was different from the Destrampis in many ways. Where Tara's childhood had been stable and structured, Stephen's was more complicated, more uncertain. As a young man, Stephen attended Macon Community College for a 2-year program before moving on to Michigan State University. He worked at Denny's to support himself and, according to some who knew him, had a habit of embellishing his life story. He would tell people he came from money, that he drove sports cars, that he raced his Mazda. How much of it was true, only Stephen knew. But those who knew him from childhood remembered him differently. As awkward, unpopular, not particularly handsome. The kind of person, one friend later said, who might rob a liquor store and leave his name tag on. Stephen had worked as an intern, and then a legislative aide in the office of State Senator Jack Faxon, answering phones and handling correspondence. But when Senator Faxon's political career ended in 1994 after 30 years of service, Stephen's position ended with it. It was around this time, in the summer of 1994, that Stephen and Tara met. The details of their first meeting aren't entirely clear. Some accounts suggest it was at a party, others that they met through mutual friends. What is clear is that they began dating, and despite their differences, Tara beautiful, ambitious, perfectionist, Stephen less polished, less driven, less successful, they formed a connection. Tara loved art. She would spend hours in museums, studying paintings and sculptures, losing herself in creative expression. And Stephen, knowing this about her, planned a proposal that would speak to her heart. He took her to the Detroit Institute of Arts. And there, on the steps of that grand institution, he asked her to marry him. She said yes. The wedding took place, though the exact date and details remain private, lost to time, or simply never shared with the public. What matters is that Tara and Stephen began their married life together. And in the years that followed, they welcomed 2 children into the world. A daughter, Lindsay, born in 2000, and a son, Ian, born in 2003. By all outward appearances, they had built a good life. They lived in Washington Township, about 30 miles north of Detroit, in a comfortable home in a nice neighborhood. The children attended private school. They even employed a nanny, a 19-year-old au pair from Germany named Verena Dierkes, to help with childcare. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Cracks that would eventually shatter everything. By 2007, Tara and Steven's marriage had evolved into something different from what it had been in those early days. Tara had become the family's primary breadwinner, her success at Washington Group International providing the income that sustained their lifestyle. Steven, meanwhile, had become a stay-at-home father, caring for Lindsay and Ian while Tara traveled for work. On paper, this arrangement made sense. Someone needed to be home with the children, and Tara's career was thriving, but the reality of their daily lives created tensions that grew more difficult to ignore. Tara's job required frequent travel. She would be gone for days, sometimes weeks, flying to various locations for business. Her most recent assignment had taken her to Puerto Rico, where she worked on projects that demanded her expertise and attention. She would leave notes for her children before each trip, reminding them how much she loved them, how much they meant to her. She tried to be home on weekends when she could, to be present in their lives despite her demanding schedule. But Steven struggled with the arrangement. He felt, according to later accounts, that Tara was gone too much, that she was missing too much of the children's lives. He called himself the mom of the house, a phrase that carried undertones of resentment, of feeling diminished. He worked occasionally at his father's tool and die shop, but largely his days revolved around the domestic sphere, taking care of the children, managing the household, existing in Tara's shadow. And there was something else. Steven had developed suspicions about Tara's relationship with a coworker. He believed, or convinced himself to believe, that her frequent trips to Puerto Rico were about more than just work, that perhaps there was someone else in the picture, that her long hours away from home had a romantic component he wasn't being told about. Whether these suspicions had any basis in reality is unclear. What is clear is that they festered in Steven's mind, adding to his growing list of grievances. And then there was Verena. Verena Diarkis was young, just 19 years old when she came to the Grant household from Germany to work as an au pair. She was there to help with the children, to be an extra set of hands in a busy household. But as the weeks passed, Steven found himself drawn to her. She was there, present when Tara was away. She was someone to talk to, someone who listened. The conversations between Steven and Verena began innocently enough, but gradually they turned more personal, more intimate. Steven confessed his feelings to her, told her explicitly that he wanted to sleep with her, and somewhere in those weeks leading up to February of 2007, their relationship crossed a line. They began an affair, conducted in secret while Tara was away on business. Verena, young and perhaps naive, found herself drawn to Steven. She believed him when he explained his situation. She was, by some accounts, falling in love with him. And in the twisted logic of their hidden relationship, she wanted to protect him. The household, outwardly functional, was actually a powder keg. Resentment, jealousy, secrets, and lies, all of it building toward an inevitable explosion. The 9th of February, 2007 was a Friday. It was the day Tara Lynn Grant came home from her business trip to Puerto Rico. It was also the last day of her life. Tara called Steven from the airport when she landed, letting him know she was on her way home. But she also told him something he didn't want to hear. She would need to return to Puerto Rico earlier than planned. Not Monday, as originally scheduled, but Sunday. Just one day at home with her family before leaving again. When Tara arrived at their house in Washington Township that evening, she went upstairs to their bedroom to unpack her bags and get ready for bed. And it was there, in the privacy of their room, that Steven confronted her. According to Steven's later confession, they argued about her travel schedule, about how much she was away from home, about the co-worker Steven believed she was spending too much time with, about the nanny, Verena, and Steven's admission that he was involved with her. The argument escalated. Voices were raised. And then, according to Steven, he grabbed Tara's wrist. She responded by slapping him across the face, and something inside Steven snapped. He hit her back, but his blow was not a slap. It was a punch, delivered with enough force to send Tara falling backward. She struck her head on the floor. Steven heard the impact, heard her say something like, "That's it." But Steven didn't stop. He later told investigators that in that moment, he knew his life was over. He knew he was going to prison. And in some dark corner of his mind, he calculated that the only way to avoid that fate was to finish what he'd started. He grabbed a piece of clothing, accounts vary on exactly what it was, and wrapped it around Tara's neck, and then he strangled her. For approximately 4 minutes, he applied pressure to her throat while she struggled beneath him. Their two children, 6-year-old Lindsay and 4-year-old Ian, slept in their bedrooms nearby, unaware that their mother was dying just down the hall. Finally, Tara stopped moving. Stephen released his grip, and in the silence that followed, he realized what he had done. But rather than call for help, rather than confess immediately to what had happened, Stephen made a decision. He would hide what he'd done. He would dispose of the evidence. He would try to get away with murder. He found a belt and tied it around Tara's neck. Using it as a handle, he dragged her body from the bedroom, down the stairs, and into the garage. The belt broke at some point, sending Tara's head crashing against the concrete floor with a sound Stephen later described as like dropping a watermelon on cement. He managed to lift her body into the back of their SUV and close the door. Then he went back inside the house, trying to compose himself, trying to figure out what to do next. It was at this moment that Verena, the nanny, saw Stephen inside the house. He told her that he and Tara had argued, and that Tara had left. Verena, trusting him, believed the story. Tara's body remained in the SUV overnight while Stephen tried to formulate a plan. The next day, Saturday the 10th of February, Stephen put his plan into action. He drove Tara's SUV to his father's tool and die shop, a place where he occasionally worked, a place where he had access to equipment and privacy. Inside the workshop, Stephen laid out tarps on the floor. He removed Tara's body from the vehicle and placed it on the tarps. And then, with a hacksaw blade and bottles of whiskey to steady his nerves, he began the unthinkable task of dismembering his wife's body. It was horrific work. Stephen later confessed that he threw up during the process, that he was distraught, that he had to keep telling himself that if he didn't do this, he would spend the rest of his life in prison. That thought, the fear of consequences, gave him the resolve to continue cutting. When the grim task was complete, Stephen wrapped Tara's dismembered remains in plastic and placed them in a large plastic bin. The next morning, Sunday the 11th, he took his children's red plastic sled to Stony Creek Metro Park in Shelby Township. He placed the bin on the sled and used it to transport the remains from his car into the woods. There, in the cold Michigan winter, he scattered most of Tara's body parts, burying them in snow and brush where he hoped they would never be found. But he kept one piece back, Tara's torso, still clothed. He took it back to his garage and hid it in a Tupperware container, apparently believing that his own home was the last place investigators would think to look. With Tara's remains hidden, Stephen began the second phase of his plan, establishing an alibi, creating a narrative that would explain her absence. He waited until Wednesday, February 14th, Valentine's Day, to report his wife missing. When he called the Macomb County Sheriff's Office, he told them that he'd last seen Tara on Friday night, the 9th. He claimed that he'd overheard her talking on the phone with someone, saying, "I'll meet you at the end of the driveway." He said he'd watched her get into a dark-colored car that drove off into the night, and he said he hadn't seen or heard from her since. He explained that this wasn't the first time Tara had left, which was why he'd waited 5 days before reporting her missing. He painted a picture of a troubled marriage, of a wife who sometimes disappeared without warning. The Macomb County Sheriff's Department began their investigation, and Stephen, playing the role of concerned husband, began making media appearances. Over the next 2 weeks, Stephen Grant became a familiar face on local news. He appeared at press conferences, his eyes wide with what appeared to be worry, pleading for Tara to come home, asking anyone with information to come forward. He spoke about his love for his wife, his confusion over her disappearance, his desperate hope that she was safe somewhere. But to the investigators working the case, something felt off. Detective Pam McLean and her partner, Detective Brian Kozlowski, interviewed Stephen at his home shortly after he reported Tara missing, and their instincts immediately told them something was wrong. When we first got to the house, Stephen was very nervous. Detective McLean later recalled, "He was very fidgety. He was trying to be over-cooperative. And the more questions we started asking him, the more nervous he became. Being nervous doesn't make someone guilty. Plenty of innocent people are nervous when talking to police, but combined with other factors, it was enough to make the detectives pay closer attention. They began digging into Tara's life, looking for any indication of where she might have gone. They checked hospitals and morgues. They talked to her co-workers, including the man Stephen claimed she was having an affair with. That co-worker confirmed he'd last seen Tara at the airport when she returned from Puerto Rico, and that he'd gone straight home afterward. There was no romantic relationship between them. The detectives also learned about Verena, the young nanny. When they interviewed her, she initially said nothing about her relationship with Stephen. She was afraid of the consequences. Afraid of what might happen to her or to him if the truth came out. She was protecting him, believing his story that Tara had simply left. But the investigators kept pulling threads, kept asking questions, and slowly the truth began to emerge. On February 21st, Farina's employment agency, likely sensing the problematic nature of the situation, asked her to leave the Grant home. She complied. That same day, she returned to Germany, though she stayed in contact with Stephen in secret. Meanwhile, the search for Tara continued. On February 24th, investigators began searching Stony Creek Metro Park, a wooded area not far from the Grant home. They found nothing that day, but shortly after, a woman walking her dog in the area made a disturbing discovery, a plastic bag that appeared to contain blood. When forensic experts examined the bag, they found human blood inside, along with dog hair. The hair matched the Grant's family dog. They also found metal shavings, consistent with what would be found in a tool and die shop, and Stephen's family owned a tool and die shop where he occasionally worked. It was enough to obtain a search warrant. On March 2nd, 2007, deputies from the Macomb County Sheriff's Department arrived at the Grant home in Washington Township with a search warrant. Stephen was home when they arrived. He let them in without protest, then took the family dog for a walk while they conducted their search. He never came back. While Stephen was walking the dog, he borrowed a pickup truck from a friend and drove away. He knew what the deputies were going to find, and he knew his carefully constructed story was about to collapse. Inside the garage, deputies opened a Tupperware container, and there, still clothed, was a woman's torso, severed from the neck to the top of the thighs. It was Tara. An arrest warrant was immediately issued for Stephen Grant on charges of open murder, a charge that could be tried as either first-degree or second-degree murder at trial. But Stephen was already gone, fleeing north with no clear plan except to escape. Over the next 2 days, investigators tracked Stephen's movements through cell phone calls. He'd called his sister Kelly Green and taken liquor and pills from her house. He told her he was going to kill himself. Then he drove to Wilderness State Park, more than 225 miles north of his home, at the very tip of Michigan's Lower Peninsula. He spent the night in the park, in 14-degree weather, wearing only a shirt, slacks, and socks. No coat, no protective clothing of any kind. He'd brought the alcohol and pills with him, intending to end his life in the frozen wilderness. But he didn't die. On March 4th, law enforcement officers found him hiding under a tree, suffering from severe hypothermia and frostbite. They airlifted him by helicopter to Northern Michigan Hospital in Petoskey for emergency treatment. And it was there, in a hospital bed, while being treated for his self-inflicted injuries, that Stephen Grant confessed to everything. Over the course of approximately 2 hours, Stephen Grant told investigators the full story of what had happened on February 9th. He described the argument with Tara, the physical altercation, the strangulation. He described dragging her body to the garage, driving it to his father's shop, in the horrific process of dismembering her remains. He explained how he'd scattered the body parts in the park, how he'd hidden the torso in his garage, how he'd reported her missing and played the concerned husband for the cameras. The confession was recorded and later transcribed. In April of 2007, the Macomb County prosecutor released the 2-part confession to the public, both the transcript of the police interview and Stephen's own handwritten account of what he'd done. The details were shocking. The calculated nature of the cover-up, the cold deliberation with which he'd dismembered his wife's body, the ease with which he'd lied to investigators, to the media, to his own children. But perhaps most disturbing was what the confession revealed about Stephen's mindset. He spoke about his jealousy over Tara's co-worker. He admitted to his affair with Verena. He described his resentment over Tara's success and his own feelings of inadequacy. And he made it clear that his primary concern after killing Tara wasn't remorse. It was avoiding prison. Following the confession, investigators returned to Stony Creek Metro Park for a more thorough search. They found additional remains scattered throughout the wooded area. They also searched Stephen's father's tool and die shop, where they discovered forensic evidence, hair, blood, and small pieces of Tara's flesh clinging to equipment. The autopsy confirmed that Tara had died of strangulation. The bruising around her neck was consistent with prolonged compression. The medical examiner found evidence of a struggle, bruises on various parts of her body suggesting she'd fought back against her attacker. Tara Lynn Grant, 34 years old, successful business executive, loving mother of two, had been murdered by the man she'd married, the father of her children, in a moment of rage and jealousy. Stephen Grant's trial began in December of 2007. He faced charges of murder and mutilation of a corpse. The prosecution sought a first-degree murder conviction, arguing that the crime was premeditated. The defense countered that it was a spontaneous act born of a heated argument, without premeditation or planning. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury heard Stephen's detailed confession, a 3-hour recording made while he was being treated for hypothermia and frostbite in the hospital. They saw photographs of the crime scene, of Tara's remains, of the places where her body parts had been scattered. They heard testimony from investigators, from forensic experts, from people who knew the Grants and had witnessed the slow deterioration of their marriage. Verena Dierkes, the young nanny who had been having an affair with Stephen, was called to testify. She had to fly back from Germany to appear in court. On March 3rd, the day Stephen had called her from his flight north to confess what he'd done, she'd immediately broken off all contact with him and reported everything to investigators. Now she had to face him in court and tell the truth about their relationship. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. They had to decide, was this first-degree murder, planned and premeditated, or was it second-degree murder, a killing born of passion without prior planning? On Friday, December 21st, 2007, the jury returned with their verdict. They found Stephen Grant guilty of second-degree murder and mutilation of a corpse. The prosecution had failed to convince the jury of premeditation, but the conviction for second-degree murder was still severe. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, called Stephen Grant's actions demonic, barbaric, and dishonest. On Thursday, February 21st, 2008, Stephen Grant was sentenced to 50 to 80 years in prison for the murder charge, with an additional 6 to 10 years for the mutilation charge. The sentence is to run concurrently. He would be eligible for parole in 50 years in 2057, when he would be 87 years old. Stephen's appeals followed, as is common in criminal cases, but each one failed. In March of 2010, he lost his final appeal in state court. The Michigan Supreme Court upheld the original sentence, finding that his trial had not been unduly prejudiced by pretrial publicity, and that he had not been improperly denied access to an attorney before confessing. Stephen Grant would spend the rest of his life in prison. He is currently incarcerated at Bellamy Creek Correctional Facility in Ionia, Michigan, where he will likely remain until he dies. The ripples of Tara's murder spread far beyond the courtroom. Her death left behind 2 young children who would have to grow up without their mother, and with the knowledge that their father had killed her. Lindsay and Ian Grant, just 6 and 4 years old when their mother died, went to live with Tara's sister, Alicia Standerfer, and her husband Eric in Ohio. Alicia, who had lost her only sibling to violence, now found herself raising 4 children, her own 2 and Tara's 2. The children eventually changed their last name to Standerfer, taking their aunt's name and leaving behind the surname Grant. It was a way of distancing themselves from their father's crime, of claiming a new identity separate from the horror of what had happened. And then there was Stephen's father, William Al Grant, the man who owned the tool and die shop where his son had dismembered Tara's body, the man who had to live with the knowledge of what his son had done, and where it had been done. According to those who knew him, Al never recovered from the destruction of his family. On June 13th, 2008, just months after Stephen's sentencing, Al Grant took his own life in Capassa, Michigan. He died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound at Port Huron Hospital. He had been seeking visitation rights with his grandchildren at the time of his death, wanting to maintain some connection to Lindsay and Ian despite everything that had happened. His death added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating story. But from that tragedy, something else grew. Something purposeful. Alicia Standerfer, in the years following her sister's murder, made a decision. She would not let Tara's death be meaningless. She would not let the violence that took her sister's life go unacknowledged. Instead, she would transform that pain into action. In 2008, Alicia helped establish Tara's Walk, an annual 5-kilometer walk held in Michigan to raise money and awareness for domestic violence victims. The events, held at Freedom Hill Amphitheater in Sterling Heights, kicks off Domestic Violence Awareness Month each year. Proceeds from Tara's walk benefit the Tara Liberation Fund, which provides emergency cash assistance for domestic violence survivors. Money that can help someone escape a dangerous situation, find temporary housing, or start rebuilding their life. In the years since its founding, Tara's walk has grown. By the 10th anniversary in 2017, more than 500 people were registered for the event, including surviving family members walking in honor of lost loved ones. Lindsay and Ian, teenagers by then, traveled back to Michigan each year to participate, honoring their mother's memory and using their story to help others. At that 10th anniversary walk, Lindsay, then 16, spoke through tears to the assembled crowd. "It means absolutely so much, more than you can imagine," she said, thanking everyone for their continued support. Ian, 14 at the time, spoke about the importance of awareness. "So if I can see things like that, I can know what's going on and I can help," he said. "It's preventable. And even if you're not directly affected by domestic violence, you can still help someone who is." Alicia herself gave an emotional speech that day, speaking about what she called the biggest mistake of her life. "I witnessed the controlling behavior," she told the crowd, "but was naive and afraid to step up and say anything to that loved one. I assumed she could handle herself. And that was the worst mistake of my life." Tara was murdered at the hands of her husband, and we knew we had to use what happened to her to make something better of it. It was a powerful admission that even those closest to victims sometimes fail to see the warning signs or fail to act on them out of fear or uncertainty. But it was also a call to action, a reminder that domestic violence is preventable, that intervention is possible, that speaking up can save lives. Tara's story, tragic as it is, has become a teaching tool. Multiple books have been written about the case, including A Slaying in the Suburbs, The Tara Grant Murder by Andrea Billups and Steve Miller, and Limb from Limb by George Hunter and Melissa Preddy. Television programs on Investigation Discovery, Court TV, and other networks have featured episodes about Tara's murder, reaching millions of viewers and keeping her story alive. And through it all, Tara is remembered not just as a victim, but as a mother, a sister, a friend, a successful professional, a woman who loved art and worked hard and left notes for her children, reminding them they were loved. Her life mattered. Her death mattered. And the legacy she left behind continues to make a difference. As you lie here in the darkness, letting this story settle into your consciousness, consider what it tells us about the lives we live, the secrets we keep, the warning signs we ignore. Tara Lynn Grant appeared to have it all. A successful career, 2 beautiful children, a comfortable home in a nice neighborhood. But beneath that surface, there was jealousy, resentment, control, and ultimately violence. The perfect life was an illusion, hiding fractures that would eventually shatter everything. Domestic violence doesn't always announce itself with dramatic gestures. Sometimes it's subtle. A pattern of control, a building resentment, an inability to accept a partner's success or independence. Sometimes the danger grows slowly in the shadows, until one day it explodes into tragedy. Tara's story reminds us to pay attention, to trust our instincts when something feels wrong, to speak up when we see controlling behavior, jealousy, isolation, to believe victims when they reach out, to understand that domestic violence can happen anywhere, to anyone, regardless of wealth or education or appearance. And it reminds us that from even the darkest tragedies, something meaningful can grow. Tara's walk continues. The Tara Liberation Fund continues. Lindsay and Ian continue to share their story, to raise awareness, to help prevent others from experiencing what they experienced. Tara Lynn Grant lived 34 years. She was a daughter, a sister, a mother, a wife, a colleague, a friend. She loved art and worked hard and achieved success through determination and intelligence. And though her life was cut short by violence, her legacy lives on in her children, in the annual walk that bears her name, in the lives saved by the awareness her story has raised. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolded in the quiet streets of a small English town. A story of hidden resentments, deception, and a life taken far too soon. This is the story of Liam Smith. The evening of November 24, 2022 began like any other in the quiet residential neighborhood of Shevington, near Wigan, in Greater Manchester. Kilburn Drive was the kind of street where everyone knew their neighbors, where children played in front gardens, and where nothing terrible was supposed to happen. Liam Smith was 38 years old, a devoted father to two boys, aged 15 and 11. They were his world, his reason for working hard, his motivation for everything he did. He was a former soldier who had found his calling as an electrician, running his own business called LPS Electrical and Build Limited. Those who knew him described him as kind-hearted, generous, someone who would do anything for anyone. He had even participated in fundraising efforts for friends in need, showing the depth of his character and compassion. That Thursday evening, it was one of those rare occasions when Liam was home alone. His boys weren't with him. The house on Kilburn Drive was quiet. Outside, the November darkness had settled early, as it does in late autumn in England. The streetlights cast their amber glow across the peaceful road. What Liam didn't know was that someone had been watching his house. Someone had been planning. Someone had been waiting. For 10 hours that day, a dark gray Mitsubishi Shogun had been parked nearby, its occupant patient, methodical, watching the comings and goings of Liam's daily life. The vehicle bore false registration plates, R22ORA. These plates, like much of what would unfold, were carefully chosen to deceive. At approximately 6:30 in the evening, a figure emerged from that vehicle. The person wore a high-visibility jacket and a head torch, a kind of attire that wouldn't seem out of place for a utility worker or someone checking on infrastructure. The figure walked up to Liam's home, approaching his door with purpose. Inside, Liam heard something. Perhaps a knock. Perhaps a voice. Whatever the reason, he made the decision to step outside his front door to investigate. It was an ordinary response to an ordinary situation, or so it seemed. He turned left out of his driveway, and that's when his life changed forever. The sound of a single gunshot shattered the evening quiet of Kilburn Drive. CCTV cameras from a nearby address captured the audio, that sharp crack echoing through what had been a peaceful neighborhood. Liam Smith had been shot in the face at close range with a modified shotgun. The wound was fatal almost immediately, but the horror didn't end there. The figure who had lured Liam from his home, the person who had pulled the trigger, wasn't finished. The Mitsubishi Shogun drove around the block. The shooter took time to retrieve containers from the vehicle, returning to where Liam lay dying or already dead in the street. First came sulfuric acid, poured deliberately onto Liam's face and body. Then came soda crystals, added to intensify the chemical reaction. The acid burned away flesh where it made contact, a brutal and unnecessary addition to an already devastating attack. By the time members of the public discovered Liam's body at the bottom of his driveway, the chemicals were still reacting, still fizzing on his skin. Emergency services arrived quickly. Police, fire service, ambulance crews all converged on Kilburn Drive, but there was nothing they could do. Liam Smith was gone. His family would later describe it as every parent's worst nightmare, every sibling's deepest fear. Two young boys would never see their father again. A family's rock had been taken from them in the most barbaric circumstances imaginable. The question that would haunt investigators, and eventually the courtroom, was simple but profound. Why? Why had someone planned and executed such a grotesquely violent killing? What could possibly motivate someone to commit murder in this way? The answer would lead detectives on a months-long investigation spanning multiple counties, involving hundreds of hours of CCTV footage, phone records, and forensic evidence. And at the heart of it all would be two people, a relationship, and events that had occurred years before. Detective Chief Inspector Gina Brennan of Greater Manchester Police's Major Incident Team found herself facing what she would later describe as a shocking murder. Standing on Kilburn Drive that night with emergency vehicles lighting up the darkness and a victim whose identity was still being confirmed, she knew they were dealing with something unusual. The hazardous substances had to be made safe. The area had to be secured. And most importantly, they had to figure out who Liam Smith was and why anyone would want him dead. As DCI Brennan would later explain to the media, she initially knew nothing about the victim. Liam Smith was, by all accounts, a family man, a hard worker, someone without enemies. The brutality of the attack suggested rage, hatred, premeditation, but nothing in Liam's life seemed to explain it. The investigation team began the painstaking work of gathering evidence. They collected CCTV footage from multiple sources: doorbell cameras, dash cams, a bin wagon, an Asda delivery van. Piece by piece, they began to reconstruct the movements of that mysterious Mitsubishi Shogun. What the footage revealed was chilling. The vehicle had been outside Liam's home for almost 10 hours before the shooting. The killer hadn't acted on impulse. This was surveillance. This was planning. This was execution in the most literal sense. But the Shogun itself remained a mystery. It carried false plates. Its true registration was unknown. And crucially, the vehicle had vanished. Then, a couple of weeks into the investigation, came the breakthrough that DCI Brennan would describe as the thread that unraveled the entire case. Intelligence arrived from South Yorkshire Police. 3 weeks before Liam's murder, a vehicle had been stopped during a routine check. Inside that vehicle were found false registration plates, the very same plates that had been used on the night of the killing, Y220RA. The vehicle had been stopped. The occupant had been identified, and suddenly investigators had a name: Michael Hillier. To understand what happened to Liam Smith, we have to go back 3 years, to September 2019. This was before the pandemic, before lockdowns, when dating apps were simply a common way for people to meet. Rachel Fulstow, then 33 years old, an international travel and tourism management graduate from Leeds Met University, was active on Tinder, the popular dating application. She matched with Liam Smith. He traveled from Wigan to York to meet her, and they went on a date. By all accounts, it was an ordinary encounter. They spent time together. They went to a hotel. According to what would later emerge in court, they had sexual contact that Fulstow would describe as non-consensual, though she wouldn't use the word rape, and said they went for lunch together the following day. Whatever happened that night in York, Fulstow appeared to move on with her life. Liam Smith certainly did. He returned to Wigan, to his work, to his children, to his everyday existence. There was no indication that this brief encounter meant anything significant to either party. But then, around 15 months later, Rachel Fulstow met someone new. On the dating app Hinge this time, she connected with a man named Michael Hillier. Michael Hillier was 39 years old, from Sheffield. He wasn't your typical dating app user. As would later be revealed in court, he was involved in what he described as a large-scale cannabis production and distribution operation. His house on Ecclesall Road in Sheffield was, according to Fulstow's later testimony, a mess, with the dining room and 2 upstairs rooms containing tents for growing cannabis. But Fulstow began a relationship with him nonetheless. At first, it seemed to go well. Hillier's Instagram account would later be shown to jurors, revealing photographs of the couple smiling, kissing, on nights out, at restaurants, on weekend breaks and holidays both in the United Kingdom and internationally. Yet beneath the surface, things were far from perfect. Fulstow would later testify that Hillier could be verbally abusive, moody, unpredictable. She said he had mental health issues and was a heavy user of diazepam. She claimed he wasn't happy about her past one-night stand with Liam Smith, that he found it not classy and that it was something he kept bringing up. According to Hillier's own later testimony, at some point in early 2022, Fulstow confided in him. She told him he claimed that she had been graphically raped by Liam Smith during their encounter in York. This claim would become central to what followed. Whether it was true, partially true, or entirely fabricated, would remain forever uncertain. As the judge would later tell the jury, what really happened that night in York would probably never be known. And ultimately, it didn't matter for the purposes of the trial. What mattered was that Michael Hillier claimed to believe his girlfriend had been assaulted. And instead of going to the police, instead of pursuing justice through legal channels, the couple made a different decision. They decided, as Hillier would put it in his own words, to go down the vigilante route. The prosecution would later argue that the planning for Liam Smith's murder began as early as May 2022. A full 6 months before the killing. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a spontaneous act of rage. This was methodical, calculated, and coldly executed. Rachel Folstow's internet search history would become a crucial piece of evidence. She had searched for Liam Smith's electrical company, LPS Electrical and Build Limited. She had looked up information about Mitsubishi Shogun vehicles, the exact type of car that would later be used in the murder. She had searched for the meaning of the word premeditated and the phrase, "does acid corrode stainless steel?" These weren't innocent queries. They were the digital footprints of someone involved in planning a serious crime. Michael Hillier, meanwhile, was acquiring the materials and means to carry out the attack. He obtained false registration plates, multiple sets to disguise the vehicle he would use. He got hold of a modified shotgun. He acquired sulfuric acid and soda crystals, chemicals that would serve no legitimate purpose in his life, but would become instruments of torture. On November 2nd, 2022, 3 weeks before the murder, Hillier made a reconnaissance trip to Wigan. He drove the Mitsubishi Shogun, fitted with cloned plates showing the registration, EJ57 UPE, and conducted what the prosecution would call hostile reconnaissance on Liam's address. He lay in wait, watching, learning Liam's patterns, all while Liam went about his daily business completely unaware that he was being surveilled, completely ignorant of the danger that was circling him. Then Hillier returned to Sheffield to wait. November 24, 2022 was a Thursday. For Liam Smith, it should have been just another day of work, another evening at home, another step in his ordinary life. But Michael Hillier had chosen this day. He set out from Sheffield in the early morning hours, driving the Mitsubishi Shogun, now fitted with the distinctive false plates, R22ORA. The vehicle had tinted windows. The back had linear damage behind the rear wheel arch, and was missing a lens on the front offside fog light. A high-visibility jacket was draped over the driver's seat. Hillier arrived on Kilburn Drive and began his wait. 10 hours. From morning through afternoon into early evening. He sat in that vehicle, watching Liam's house. CCTV would later capture the Shogun's presence, footage that would prove invaluable to investigators. Back in York, Rachel Folstow was going about her day, but her phone records and search history told a different story. On the morning of the killing, she checked the weather in Wigan. Why would someone in York need to know the weather conditions in a town over 70 miles away? Unless they were expecting something to happen there. As the afternoon turned to evening and darkness fell over, Shivington Hillier made his final preparations. He put on the high-visibility jacket. He equipped himself with the head torch, and he walked up to Liam Smith's home. What exactly was said to lure Liam out remains unknown. Perhaps Hillier claimed there was a problem with the utilities. Perhaps he said there was an issue with the street. Whatever the pretext, it worked. Liam opened his door and stepped outside to investigate, turning left out of his driveway. The shotgun blast came immediately. Liam had no chance to defend himself. No chance to run, no chance to even understand what was happening to him. The single shot to the face was fatal. Then came the acid attack, that final unnecessary brutality that turned murder into something even more horrific. Hillier drove away, circling the block before fleeing the scene entirely. The Mitsubishi Shogun was later found burned out, destroyed to eliminate evidence. By the time emergency services arrived and members of the public were trying to comprehend what had happened on their quiet street, Michael Hillier was already making his way back to Sheffield and then onward to York, to Rachel Folstow's house. When Michael Hillier arrived at Rachel Folstow's home in Andrew Drive, York, the morning after the murder, she would later claim that this was the first she knew of any attack on Liam Smith. She testified that she was shocked, horrified, and too petrified of Hillier to go to the police. But the prosecution would paint a very different picture. They would argue that Folstow was not a victim of Hillier's actions, but rather a co-conspirator who had helped plan and encourage the murder. 6 days after Liam Smith's death, as his family was planning his funeral and his 2 sons were trying to process the loss of their father, Michael Hillier and Rachel Folstow boarded a plane. Their destination, Jamaica, a 2-week holiday in the Caribbean. The prosecution would later ask the jury to consider this. What innocent person, learning that their boyfriend had committed murder, would then go on holiday with them to Jamaica? What terrified victim would board an international flight with the man they claimed to fear? Folstow's explanation was that she felt horrendous about what Hillier had done and just wanted to get through the holiday and go home. But to investigators and prosecutors, this trip looked like something else entirely, a celebration, a reward, or at the very least the behavior of someone complicit in a terrible crime. While they were in Jamaica, the investigation in Greater Manchester was gaining momentum. The CCTV analysis was revealing the Shogun's movements. The South Yorkshire Police Intelligence had provided Hillier's name. Phone records were being examined. Digital evidence was being collected. When the couple returned to England, the net was closing. In January 2023, Michael Hillier was arrested on suspicion of murder. In February, Rachel Fulstow was also arrested. Initially, Fulstow was treated as a potential witness rather than a suspect. But as investigators interviewed her, inconsistencies emerged. She repeatedly lied to officers, changing her story, withholding information. What had started as witness interviews turned into interrogations of a suspect. The investigation team, hundreds of officers working under DCI Brennan's direction, were meticulously building their case. They had CCTV evidence showing the Shogun outside Liam's home for 10 hours. They had the vehicle stopped from 3 weeks before the murder that placed those false plates in Hillier's possession. They had phone records showing Fulstow checking Wiegand's weather on the morning of the killing. They had her internet searches about Mitsuji Shoguns and the meaning of premeditated. They had, in DCI Brennan's words, pulled a thread that caused a house of cards to collapse, leading from one piece of evidence to another, from Michael Hillier to Rachel Fulstow. Both were charged with murder. The case would go to trial at Minshull Street Crown Court in Manchester. The trial began in July 2023, nearly 8 months after Liam Smith's death. His family filled the public gallery, there to see justice for their beloved Liam, to hear the truth about what had happened and why. Michael Hillier admitted to manslaughter, but denied murder. His defense was that he had been driven by a desire to seek justice for Rachel Fulstow, whom he believed had been raped by Liam Smith. He presented himself, in his own words, as a knight in shining armor, someone acting to defend his girlfriend's honor. Rachel Fulstow denied everything. She denied murder, denied manslaughter, and denied perverting the course of justice. She claimed she had no knowledge, that Hillier planned to harm Liam Smith, and that she was an innocent victim of her boyfriend's violence. The prosecution, led by Jason Pitter King's counsel, presented a different narrative. They argued that both defendants had carefully plotted Liam's murder together, that they had decided to act as judge, jury, and executioner, and that Liam Smith had been executed in a grotesquely violent way. As the evidence was presented, Liam's family had to endure hearing their loved one's name tainted. The defense's claims about what had happened between Liam and Fulstow in York meant that Liam was being accused of serious wrongdoing, and he wasn't there to defend himself, to give his side of the story, to challenge the allegations. The family wept uncontrollably as CCTV footage was played in court, including the audio of the gunshot that ended Liam's life. They had to sit through testimony about the acid attack, about the chemicals fizzing on their loved one's body, about the 10 hours Hillier spent surveilling their family member's home. The defense tried various strategies. They attempted to blame each other, with Hillier claiming Fulstow had encouraged him and Fulstow claiming she knew nothing. But the digital evidence was damning. The phone records, the internet searches, the patterns of behavior all painted a picture of joint enterprise, of two people working together toward a common goal. Judge Maurice Green told the jury that they did not need to decide what had actually happened between Liam Smith and Rachel Fulstow in York that night in 2019. As he put it in his summing up, what really happened would probably never be known, and it probably didn't matter, because whatever had happened, whatever the truth was, it could never justify the extreme violence that had been visited upon Liam Smith. After 6 hours and 44 minutes of deliberations, the jury returned. 2 of the jurors appeared tearful as they came back into court. They had reached their verdicts. Michael Hillier, guilty of murder. Rachel Fulstow, guilty of murder and guilty of perverting the course of justice. Liam's family shouted yes and thank you so much, and sobbed and hugged each other. Michael Hillier, handcuffed in the dock, stared over at Rachel Fulstow. As the verdicts were read out, neither defendant showed any visible remorse. The following day, August 25, 2023, Michael Hillier and Rachel Fulstow returned to court for sentencing. Judge Maurice Green described the murder as brutal and cold-blooded. He told the defendants that whatever had happened between Fulstow and Liam Smith, they had decided to exact their own vengeance. They had decided to exact their own vengeance. They had decided to act as judge, jury, and executioner. Addressing Rachel Fulstow, the judge said it was almost incomprehensible that someone with her education and background had acted the way she did. He emphasized that whatever had happened between her and Liam Smith could never be justification for what she and Michael Hillier had done. The sentences were severe, reflecting the gravity of the crime. Michael Hillier was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 33 years. Rachel Fulstow was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 30 years, plus an additional 18 months for perverting the course of justice, to run concurrently. Together, the couple faced a combined 63 years in prison before they could even be considered for parole. Outside the court, Detective Inspector Lee Shaw read a statement prepared by Liam's family. Their words were heartbreaking in their simplicity and depth of emotion. They spoke of Liam as more than just a family member. He was their rock. He was our Liam. They described him as having the biggest and most kind-hearted soul. Someone who would literally do anything for anyone. They spoke of his two boys, who were his biggest legacy. He had been genuinely the best dad ever. And everything he did in life was for his two boys. Those boys would now have to grow up without their loving father, never seeing him at their own life milestones, never having him there as adults, never giving him the chance to be a grandfather. The family made it clear that Liam's life wasn't the only one destroyed that night. Everyone who knew and loved him had been left completely heartbroken, devastated, and traumatized. It had been a living nightmare for them all, something they would never wish on any other family. And they spoke of the trial itself, of how Liam's name had been tainted throughout, of how the accusations made against him weren't the Liam they knew. They said that he had been denied the chance to publicly clear his name, to defend himself against claims made after his death. Detective Chief Inspector Gina Brennan spoke to the media afterward. She acknowledged that while she could tell Liam's family that she had found those responsible for his murder, she had to do so in the worst of all circumstances, where his name had been besmirched and tainted. Liam had been unable to defend himself throughout the process, which made it even more heartbreaking for his family. She noted that neither defendant had shown any signs of remorse while sitting in court, nor had they recognized the magnitude of what they had done and the impact on Liam's family and ultimately his two boys. The investigation team's work was later recognized with awards from the Greater Manchester Police Chief Constable. The complexity of the case, the hundreds of hours of work, the careful piecing together of evidence from CCTV, phone records, and witness testimony had resulted in justice being served. As you drift towards sleep tonight, there are perhaps some questions worth considering about this case. What drives two people to plan and execute a murder, rather than simply going to the police? If Rachel Fulstow truly believed she had been assaulted, why not report it to authorities? Why instead embark on months of planning to kill someone? What was the real nature of Hillier and Fulstow's relationship? Was she, as she claimed, a terrified victim of his abuse, petrified to go to police? Or was she, as the prosecution argued, an active participant who encouraged and enabled the murder? And perhaps most poignantly, what would Liam Smith say if he could speak? What was his version of events from that night in York in 2019? We will never know. He was denied the chance to defend himself, denied the chance to tell his truth. What we do know is this: Liam Smith was 38 years old. He was a father who loved his sons unconditionally. He was a hard worker who ran his own electrical business. He was a former soldier who had served his country. He was someone who participated in charity fundraising for friends in need. He was, by all accounts from those who actually knew him, a good man. He deserved to watch his sons grow up. He deserved to become a grandfather. He deserved to live out his life in peace on Kilburn Drive in Shevington. Instead, he was executed outside his own home in a plot that had been months in the making. His life was taken brutally, and then his body was subjected to further violence even in death. But justice eventually was served. The investigation team worked tirelessly to find the truth. The jury saw through the lies and deception, and two people who thought they could act as judge, jury, and executioner now face decades in prison for their crimes. Liam's sons will grow up knowing that the people responsible for taking their father from them were held accountable. His family can find some measure of closure, knowing that justice was done. And perhaps that's where we can leave this story tonight. With justice served, with truth uncovered, with a family that continues to remember and honor their Liam. As you close your eyes and let sleep come, remember that even in the darkest of cases, even when evil manifests in careful planning and cold execution, There are dedicated investigators who work tirelessly to find the truth. There are juries who carefully weigh evidence. There are judges who impose appropriate punishment. The system doesn't always work perfectly, but in the case of Liam Smith, it did work. The truth emerged. Justice was delivered. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight, we're going to explore a story that unfolded in Central Florida in early 2024. It's a case that speaks to the darkest corners of human nature, but also to the tireless work of investigators who refuse to let the truth remain hidden. In the warm days of late February 2024, in a quiet apartment complex in Kissimmee, Florida, a young girl named Madeline Soto was celebrating her 13th birthday. Friends and family knew her as Maddie, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed teenager who was just beginning to navigate the complicated waters of adolescence. Her birthday fell on February 22nd, and her family gathered to celebrate. There were smiles, there was cake, there was the promise of another year ahead. Maddie was a student at Hunters Creek Middle School in Orlando, just a short drive from the apartment she shared with her mother, Jennifer Soto, and her mother's boyfriend, a 37-year-old man named Stephen Stearns. The living arrangement was unconventional, to say the least. The apartment also housed another roommate, which meant space was at a premium. According to later accounts, the family had worked out a system where Jennifer, Maddie, and Stearns rotated between two bedrooms. Sometimes, Jennifer would send Maddie and Stearns to sleep in the upstairs bedroom while she took the primary room downstairs. Other times, all three would share the king-size bed together. It was an arrangement that Jennifer would later describe to investigators with a mixture of matter-of-fact acceptance and underlying discomfort. She admitted that she sent them upstairs when she needed a good night's sleep, though she also confessed to detectives that she had never felt entirely comfortable with Stearns sleeping in the same bed as her daughter. In one chilling statement, she told police she had always feared the relationship between Stearns and Maddie would become what she called a Woody Allen situation, a reference to the filmmaker's controversial marriage to his former girlfriend's adopted daughter. Still, life continued. The birthday celebration on the 25th was reportedly pleasant. There was no outward indication that anything terrible was about to unfold. The morning of Monday, February 26th, began like many others in the Soto household, at least on the surface. Jennifer Soto would later tell investigators that she had asked Maddie and Stearns to sleep in the upstairs bedroom the night before because she wanted to get a good night's rest. Her new job had been exhausting her, and she needed the space to sleep alone. According to Jennifer's initial account to police, she woke around 7 or 8 in the morning to the sound of Stearns taking their dog for a walk. She said she didn't hear Maddie getting ready for school. No shower running, no footsteps, no sounds of a teenager preparing for her day. This should have struck her as unusual, but in the chaos of a Monday morning, Jennifer said she didn't think much of it. Stearns told everyone that he would take Maddie to school that morning. He claimed he dropped her off near Peace United Methodist Preschool, which was a few blocks away from Hunters Creek Middle School, around 8:40 in the morning. This detail seemed odd to investigators. School didn't start until 9:30, and why would he drop her at a preschool rather than the middle school itself? Stearns explained that Maddie had asked to be let out there so she could walk the rest of the way. Jennifer went about her day, assuming her daughter was safely at school. But when she arrived at Hunters Creek Middle School around 4:30 that afternoon to pick Maddie up, school officials delivered devastating news. Maddie had never arrived at school that day. She hadn't been in first period. She hadn't been in second period. She hadn't been seen at all. Jennifer's world immediately began to unravel. She called Maddie's best friend hoping for some explanation, some simple misunderstanding, but the friend confirmed it. Maddie hadn't come to school. Nobody had seen her. At approximately 8 o'clock that evening, Jennifer reported her daughter missing. The wheels of investigation began to turn. When Orange County Sheriff's deputies arrived to take the missing person report, they began asking the standard questions. When was Maddie last seen? What was she wearing? Who was the last person to see her? The answers led them directly to Stephen Stearns. Stearns seemed cooperative at first. He repeated his story about dropping Maddie off near the church, several blocks from school. He said she had seemed fine, just sleepy. He claimed he had watched her walk away before he drove off. But investigators found several details of his story troubling. For one thing, nobody at the school had called to report Maddie's absence. This was a failure of the school's attendance system, but it also meant that precious hours had passed without anyone knowing something was wrong. As one school board member would later note, the first hour after a child goes missing is the most critical for recovery. Every hour after that, the chances diminish. Investigators began reviewing security footage from the apartment complex and surrounding areas. License plate readers, traffic cameras, surveillance systems, all were scrutinized, and what they found contradicted Stearns' story completely. At 7:30 in the morning on February 26, security cameras captured Stearns' vehicle pulling up to a dumpster at the Venetian Bay apartment complex. Stearns, wearing a red shirt and tan pants, was seen exiting the vehicle and throwing away 2 large white trash bags. The footage showed something else, something that made investigators' blood run cold. In the passenger seat of Stearns' vehicle was a figure wearing a green sweatshirt, the same green sweatshirt Maddie had been wearing. But the figure's positioning was all wrong. Her head was slumped over to the left at an unnatural angle. She didn't move when Stearns got out of the car. She didn't move when he got back in. The detectives who reviewed that footage came to a grim conclusion. Maddie was already dead. Further footage from 8:10 that morning showed Stearns driving south on John Young Parkway. The investigation revealed that he had made multiple trips that morning, leaving and returning to the apartment complex. License plate readers tracked his movements. He was heading toward a wooded area in Osceola County near the town of St. Cloud. When investigators searched the dumpster where Stearns had thrown those trash bags, they found Maddie's backpack with its distinctive Hawaiian print. Inside was her school-issued laptop. They also found a single white crock, the mate to one found in the bedroom where Maddie lived. Stearns had never taken Maddie to school. Instead, investigators believed he had spent the early morning hours disposing of evidence and moving her body. On February 27th, detectives brought Stearns in for questioning. He sat in an interrogation room for over 5 hours. For the first 3 hours, he simply slept at the desk, his head down, seemingly unbothered by the fact that his girlfriend's daughter was missing. When detectives finally began their questioning, Stearns maintained his story, though it began to shift in small ways. He told them he had stopped at a vape shop that morning, and that Maddie had been asleep in the passenger seat while he went inside. When pressed about her position, he said she had reclined the seat and was leaning back, just kind of conked out napping. The detectives asked for permission to search his cell phone. Stearns agreed, but with a caveat that immediately raised red flags. He said he had accidentally performed a factory reset on his phone. On February 26th, the very day Maddie went missing, he claimed he was trying to update it. The technical forensics team later discovered that the phone had actually been factory reset twice within a 12-hour period before it was turned over to police. The first reset occurred at 12:12 in the afternoon on February 26th. This was no accident. This was someone trying desperately to hide something. But Stearns had made a critical mistake. While the factory reset had erased data from the phone itself, it couldn't touch what was stored in the cloud. Investigators obtained access to Stearns' Google Drive account, and what they found there would transform the investigation from a missing person case into something far more sinister. The images and videos on Stearns' Google Drive told a horrifying story, one that had been unfolding for years. Hidden in plain sight, there were more than 1,500 files, and they depicted Maddie in sexual situations. The abuse investigators determined had begun when she was just 8 years old. The evidence was overwhelming and deeply disturbing. These were not images that could be explained away or misinterpreted. They were clear documentation of ongoing sexual abuse, carefully recorded and stored by Stearns himself. When confronted with this evidence, Jennifer Soto's world collapsed. Detectives sat her down and showed her the photos. Her reaction was complicated and would become a subject of intense scrutiny. According to police reports, her emotions appeared, in their assessment, somewhat fictitious. She cried. Yes, but investigators noted that she seemed more protective of Stearns than concerns about her daughter. In one telling exchange after being shown photographic evidence of Stearns abusing Maddie, Jennifer's first instinct was to ask if Stearns needed a lawyer. Detectives confronted her about this. They pointed out that she had just seen proof of her daughter being victimized, and her immediate thought was to protect her abuser. Jennifer would eventually tell investigators that she believed Stearns was guilty, but only after being shown the surveillance footage of Maddie slumped in his car. Even then, she made statements that troubled the investigators. She referred to the sexual abuse as the sex stuff, distinguishing it from the murder, which she called evil. The detectives noted that she didn't show the same level of emotion about the ongoing victimization as she did about the disappearance. In later interviews, Jennifer admitted she had been aware of Stearns grooming and abusing Maddie, though she claimed she had been oblivious to the full extent. She called him a master liar and master manipulator, someone who had deceived her completely. She said she wanted to believe he was innocent, even as the evidence mounted against him. Investigators learned troubling details about the household dynamics. The roommate who lived with them told police she had never seen Stearns take Maddie to school before. The story about him being the one to drop her off that morning immediately seemed suspicious. The roommate also provided information about the strange sleeping arrangements, and mentioned that the living situation often felt uncomfortable. Even more disturbing, investigators discovered that Stearns had been secretly filming the roommate as well. They found images on his phone taken with his cell phone, positioned under the bathroom door to capture the roommate nude. She had never given permission for these photos. It painted a picture of a man with a pattern of violating boundaries and documenting his violations. While all of this was unfolding, Stearns was supposedly helping search for Maddie. On the night of February 27th, he and Jennifer stayed at a hotel near Walt Disney World with Stearns' father. Jennifer would later tell police that Stearns was very panicky because he wanted his cell phone back from investigators. Both Jennifer and Stearns seemed convinced that police were targeting the wrong person. But during that night, Stearns did something that investigators found deeply suspicious. He slipped out of the hotel without telling anyone and drove all the way to Northport, nearly 2 hours away where his parents lived. When his father later asked why he had made this trip, Stearns gave a vague answer. "I had wanted to grab a few things," Stearns said in a recorded phone call from jail, "and get my ducks in a row. Kind of prepare myself for whatever was coming, but I couldn't find what I was looking for." Investigators believed they knew exactly what he was looking for. They think he was attempting to log into his Google account using his parents' Wi-Fi to delete the incriminating images and videos. The attempts were unsuccessful. He couldn't remember his password, or perhaps Google's security measures prevented him from accessing the account from a new location. During the same phone call with his father, the conversation took a chilling turn. Stearns' father said he wished he could understand how the whole situation came about. Stearns replied, simply, "Well, I didn't start it." His father pointed out that Stearns had participated in it. Stearns said, "Yeah." At no point during this conversation did Stearns deny murdering Maddie. On March 1st, after days of intensive searching, deputies found Maddie's body in a wooded area off Hickory Tree Road in Osceola County. It was a remote location, surrounded by trees, far from any main roads, the kind of place where someone hoped the body might never be discovered. The medical examiner who responded to the scene immediately noted several telling details. The bottoms of Maddie's socks were clean, indicating she hadn't walked anywhere. She had been carried or transported to this location. The medical examiner also observed that a portion of Maddie's hyoid bone, a small bone in the neck, was not intact. This injury was consistent with strangulation. The official autopsy later confirmed it. Maddie had died from strangulation. Her death was classified as a homicide, based on the timeline established by surveillance footage and witness statements. Investigators believed she had been killed in the early morning hours of February 26th, likely while she slept or shortly after waking. That night, a vigil was held near Hunters Creek Middle School. Community members gathered to remember a young girl whose life had been stolen just days after her 13th birthday. They lit candles. They shared memories. They wept for a child they couldn't save. On February 28th, just 2 days after Maddie was reported missing and before her body was even found, an arrest warrant was issued for Stephen Stearns. He was initially charged with sexual battery and possession of child sexual abuse material. He was taken into custody and held without bond. As the investigation continued, the charges multiplied. Eventually, Stearns would face 60 counts related to sexual crimes. 8 counts of capital sexual battery on a child under the age of 12, 5 counts of sexual battery on someone between the ages of 12 and 18, 7 counts of lewd or lascivious molestation, and 40 counts of unlawful possession of materials depicting sexual performance by a child, 10 or more images per count. Then in April 2024, a grand jury indicted Stearns on a charge of first-degree premeditated murder. The evidence, prosecutors said, showed someone who had made calculated moves to dispose of Maddie's belongings and place her body in a remote wooded area before she was ever reported missing. The evidence shows an individual who was entrusted to keep Madeline safe, said Kissimmee Police Chief Betty Holland during a press conference. The betrayal was profound. This was someone who should have protected Maddie, and instead he had victimized her for years before finally taking her life. In June 2024, the state attorney's office announced they would seek the death penalty against Stearns. The factors supporting this decision included aggravated child abuse, the fact that Stearns was in a position of familial authority over Maddie, the heinous nature of the crime, and his prior charges. Stearns' defense attorney filed motions arguing that the death penalty violated the 5th, 6th, 8th, and 14th Amendments, that it constituted cruel and unusual punishment. They also attempted to have the evidence from Stearns' phone suppressed, arguing it had been unlawfully seized. Stearns claimed he had been under the influence of a prescription anxiety medication when he consented to the search and hadn't eaten all day. The motion argued that his consent was therefore not valid. For more than a year, the case worked its way through the legal system. Trial dates were set and continued. Defense attorneys filed dozens of motions. Prosecutors prepared their case, organizing the massive amount of evidence they had collected. Stearns' parents, interviewed by police, described their son as someone who had spent a lifetime lying to them. His mother called him a monster and accused Jennifer of knowing what was happening to Maddie for years. They expressed their disapproval of Stearns' relationship with Jennifer, citing drug use and mental illness on both sides. They painted a picture of a dysfunctional relationship where both parties would sleep all the time and bring each other down during episodes of mental illness. An ex-girlfriend of Stearns also came forward. She told detectives about their brief relationship in 2022. Even during that relationship, Stearns had refused to spend the night with her. His excuse, he insisted he had to stay at Jennifer's home because Maddie and her mother couldn't sleep without him there. In retrospect, investigators understood this differently. Stearns didn't want to spend nights away from his victim. A friend of Stearns also told police something revealing. During a conversation about his supposed breakup with Jennifer, Stearns had seemed more upset about the bond he created with Madeline than having a relationship with her mother. The focus always was on Maddie. Finally, on July 21st, 2025, over 500 days after Maddie's body was found, the case reached its conclusion without a trial. In a plea agreement carefully coordinated with Maddie's family, Stearns pleaded no contest to first-degree premeditated murder. By pleading no contest, he did not admit guilt, but accepted that the evidence against him was overwhelming. He pleaded guilty to 8 counts of capital sexual battery, with a child under 12, 5 counts of sexual battery, of someone between 12 and 18, and 7 counts of lewd or lascivious molestation. In total, he was pleading guilty to 20 sexual abuse charges in addition to the murder charge. The sentencing hearing was held on the same day as the plea. Family members and loved ones filled the courtroom, many weeping openly as they prepared to address the court. These were the people whose lives had been shattered by Stearns' actions, people who would carry the weight of this tragedy forever. Maddie's father, Tyler Wallace, spoke through tears. He hadn't been as present in Maddie's life as he'd wanted to be, something he would now regret forever. Because of the actions of this depraved man, he told the court, his voice breaking, "I will never meet the woman she was becoming, and I can't grasp it." He looked directly at Stearns. "I can't grasp the selfishness of you, the deplorability of your actions. You're depraved, you're weak, you're a coward. It doesn't heal with time." Maddie's maternal grandmother, Yolanda Zambrano, had a statement read by a prosecutor. She described feeling like a second mother to Maddie, and said Stearns had left her with a broken soul. She spoke of how Stearns had betrayed everything about Maddie, her love, her trust, her innocence, her body, and then, as if that wasn't enough, he had taken her life. And with her, he killed a piece of our souls. The courtroom heard from others who had known and loved Maddie. They spoke of a bright, joyful girl who had her whole life ahead of her. They spoke of birthdays that would never be celebrated, milestones that would never be reached, dreams that would never be fulfilled. State Attorney Monique Worrell addressed the court, emphasizing that Maddie's life was stolen in a senseless act of violence. The plea deal, she explained, meant that Stearns waived any right to appeal. He would never have another opportunity to challenge his conviction or sentence. The judge, having heard the anger and fury of shattered families and a grieving community, imposed his sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder charge. Additionally, Stearns received 20 more life sentences for the sexual abuse charges. 21 life sentences in total, all to run concurrently. There would be no possibility of parole, no second chances. Stephen Stearns, at 39 years old, would spend the rest of his life behind bars. As the case concluded, one question lingered in many minds. What about Jennifer Soto? She had sent her daughter to sleep in the same bed as Stearns on the night before Maddie's death. She had admitted to having concerns about their relationship, to fearing a Woody Allen situation. She had allowed this living arrangement to continue despite her discomfort. Investigators had noted her contradictory statements, her apparent protection of Stearns even after seeing evidence of abuse, her reaction to the discovery of the sexual abuse material. Some witnesses, including Stearns' own mother, accused her of knowing about the abuse for years. Yet Jennifer was never charged with any crime. The investigation focused squarely on Stearns as the perpetrator. Whether prosecutors found insufficient evidence to charge her, or whether other considerations played a role, remains unclear. She did not attend Stearns' sentencing hearing. The case raises uncomfortable questions about how abuse can continue hidden in plain sight, about the signs that might have been missed or ignored, about the systems that failed to protect a vulnerable child. Maddie's school never called to report her absence that crucial day. The living arrangements in the household went unchallenged. The signs were there, perhaps, but nobody connected the dots until it was too late. Maddie Soto was 13 years old. She had just celebrated her birthday. She should have had decades ahead of her. High school graduations, first loves, career ambitions, perhaps children of her own someday. Instead, her life ended in the early morning darkness of a February morning, in Florida, at the hands of someone who was supposed to protect her. Her story is one of betrayal at the deepest level, of innocence stolen, of a childhood that became a nightmare. But it's also a story of investigators who refused to accept simple explanations, who followed the evidence wherever it led, who built a case so overwhelming that even the perpetrator eventually had no choice but to accept responsibility. The case of Madeline Soto is closed now. Stephen Stearns will never leave prison, but for those who loved Maddie, her father, her grandmother, her friends, her community, the pain continues. They carry forward her memory, ensuring that even though her life was cut tragically short, she will not be forgotten. And perhaps, in sharing her story, we honor her memory in another way, by remaining vigilant, by questioning situations that don't feel right, by protecting the vulnerable among us, by refusing to look away when something seems wrong. Rest easy tonight. Maddie's story has been told. Justice, in whatever limited form it can take, has been served. And while the darkness of this case is profound, we can find some small comfort in knowing that the truth emerged, that the perpetrator was held accountable, and that Maddie is at peace. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, we're going to explore a story that unfolded in the beautiful Santa Monica Mountains of California, where nature's tranquility was shattered by an unexpected tragedy. This is the story of Tristan Baudet, a devoted father, a brilliant scientist, and a man who loved the outdoors. Let me guide you through this case, slowly, carefully, with respect for those involved. This story begins not with violence, but with promise. Tristan Thomas Baudet was born and raised in Fresno, California, where the summer heat stretched long across the Central Valley. He was the kind of student that teachers remembered fondly, the kind who excelled not through arrogance, but through genuine curiosity and dedication. In the year 2000, he graduated as valedictorian from Edison High School, achievement that surprised no one who knew his work ethic and his kind nature. From Fresno, Tristan journeyed south to the University of California, San Diego, where he immersed himself in the study of chemistry. The Pacific Ocean was nearby, the campus alive with intellectual energy, and Tristan thrived. He graduated in 2005 with his bachelor's degree, but his thirst for knowledge was far from satisfied. That same year, he enrolled at UC Berkeley to pursue his doctorate in chemistry. Berkeley, with its reputation for rigorous academic standards and groundbreaking research, would become Tristan's home for the next 5 years. His doctoral work focused on something remarkably specific and important: the synthesis and biological evaluation of acid-degradable polymeric materials for protein-based vaccines. In simpler terms, Tristan was working on ways to make vaccines safer and more effective, developing new delivery systems that could revolutionize how we protect ourselves from disease. He wasn't working alone in a laboratory. Isolated from the world, Tristan led multidisciplinary teams, bringing together chemists, immunologists, and biologists. He synthesized complex microparticles and tested their ability to trigger immune responses. He developed methods for targeted drug and gene delivery. He presented his findings at national conferences and published his work in peer-reviewed journals. By 2010, when he completed his PhD, Tristan Baudet had already made meaningful contributions to pharmaceutical science. But Tristan was more than his resume. Friends remembered him as genuinely kind, the sort of person who made everyone feel welcome. He loved the outdoors with a passion that never dimmed, hiking through mountain trails, biking along coastal paths, snowboarding down powdery slopes, camping under star-filled skies. These weren't just hobbies for Tristan. They were essential parts of who he was. After completing his doctorate, Tristan moved to Irvine, a planned city in Orange County where palm trees lined orderly streets, and the pharmaceutical industry thrived. He joined Allergan, an Irish pharmaceutical company with significant operations in California. Starting as a postdoctoral fellow in 2010, Tristan focused on drug delivery systems, applying his academic research to real-world medical applications. Over the years, Tristan climbed steadily through the ranks at Allergan. By 2015, he'd been promoted to senior scientist. His work centered on formulation and manufacturing processes for sustained-release combination products, complex pharmaceutical preparations that released medication gradually over time. By March of 2018, just months before his death, Tristan had been named an associate director, a recognition of his expertise and leadership. But even more important than his career was his family. Tristan had met his wife, Erica Wu, when they were teenagers. They grew up together, their relationship deepening from young friendship into mature love. Erica became a physician, an obstetrician who brought new life into the world, while Tristan worked to extend and improve that life through pharmaceutical innovation. Together, they had 2 daughters. By June of 2018, their girls were 4 years old and 2 years old. At those precious ages when everything is wonder and discovery, Tristan was, by all accounts, a devoted father. His selfless devotion to his children came naturally. He found joy in every aspect of fatherhood. From bedtime stories to outdoor adventures, the family was on the cusp of change. Tristan had recently decided to leave Allergan and accept a new position in the Bay Area, north of Irvine. It was a move that promised new opportunities, a new chapter for the family. Before the transition, before the chaos of moving and starting new jobs, Tristan and Erica planned to take some time off together. They wanted to savor these moments as a family, to breathe and simply be together before life accelerated again. Erica had an important exam to study for, a crucial step in her medical career, so Tristan made a decision. He would take their 2 daughters camping, giving Erica a quiet time to prepare while he and the girls enjoyed nature together. It was the kind of thoughtful gesture that defined Tristan's character. He chose Malibu Creek State Park. Malibu Creek State Park spans more than 8,000 acres in the Santa Monica Mountains, roughly 30 miles northwest of downtown Los Angeles. The park had a storied history. The land had been home to the Chumash people for thousands of years before European settlers arrived. In the early 1900s, wealthy businessmen from Los Angeles formed the Crags Country Club there, building a dam to create Century Lake. By the 1940s, 20th Century Fox purchased the property to use as a movie ranch, a place where crews could film scenes requiring natural settings without traveling far from Hollywood. Over the decades, the land became the backdrop for countless productions. The television series MASH was filmed there, Planet of the Apes scenes were shot among those volcanic rock formations. Parts of the land had even been owned by Bob Hope and Ronald Reagan before being sold to the state. California purchased the property in 1974 and opened Malibu Creek State Park to the public in 1976. It quickly became a beloved destination. The park offered 35 miles of trails, winding through oak woodlands and chaparral-covered slopes. Century Lake glimmered in the sunlight. The rock pool invited swimmers on hot days. Wildlife thrived. Mountain lions, bobcats, mule deer, golden eagles, and countless bird species made their homes in those canyons and meadows. For someone like Tristan Beaudat, who was happiest in nature, the park represented everything he loved about California's outdoors. It was close enough to Irvine for a weekend trip, but remote enough to feel like an escape from urban sprawl. But by the summer of 2018, Malibu Creek State Park harbored a dark secret that few members of the public knew about. Someone had been shooting at people there for nearly 2 years. The pattern began in November of 2016. A man sleeping in a hammock at the park was shot and wounded. Less than a week later, someone fired into the sleeping area of a vehicle. Then in January of 2017, another shooting occurred at the campground. Throughout 2017, the shootings continued. Vehicles were hit by gunfire on 3 separate occasions. Miraculously, no one in those vehicles was injured, but the incidents were terrifying. Drivers would hear sudden cracks, see damage to their cars, and realize they'd been targeted. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department was aware of these incidents. Lieutenant James Royal, stationed at Lost Hills, the local sheriff's station, grew increasingly concerned about the pattern. He urged his superiors to warn the public about the ongoing shootings. The public had a right to know that visiting Malibu Creek State Park might put them in danger, but the warnings never came. Sheriff's Department officials, for reasons that would later become the subject of lawsuits and investigations, decided not to alert the public to the series of shootings. Perhaps they worried about causing panic. Perhaps they believed the incidents were unconnected. Perhaps they thought warning people would damage the park's reputation and tourism. Whatever their reasoning, they kept quiet. Lieutenant Royal's warnings fell on deaf ears. He was told that no public warning would be issued. Later, he would claim that he was punished for his persistence, retaliated against by department brass for trying to do what he believed was right. He would file a lawsuit alleging that the department's silence had dire consequences, because the shootings didn't stop. On June 18th, 2018, just 4 days before Tristan Beaudat arrived at the park, someone shot at a white Tesla driving along Las Virgenes Road, near the park entrance. The bullet damaged the vehicle, but didn't injure the driver. It was another close call, another random act of violence in the pre-dawn hours, when few witnesses would be awake. And still, the public knew nothing. Friday, June 22nd, 2018, began like any peaceful camping morning should. The sun had not yet risen. The air was cool and still. The campground at Malibu Creek State Park was quiet, except for the sounds of nature. Birds beginning their dawn chorus, the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze. Perhaps the distant murmur of the creek. Tristan Beaudat lay sleeping in his tent alongside his 2 young daughters. His 4-year-old and 2-year-old girls were nestled close to their father, safe and warm. Nearby in another tent was Tristan's brother-in-law, Scott McCurdy, who had joined them for the camping trip with his own 2 children. It was meant to be a simple, joyful family outing. The tents were fairly new. Children's bikes were parked near the vehicles. Toys were scattered about in that comfortable chaos that marks any family campsite. Everything spoke of normal family life, of fathers spending quality time with their kids, of childhood memories being made. Then, around 4:44 in the morning, when darkness still held sway and most campers were in their deepest sleep, shots rang out. Scott McCurdy jerked awake to loud popping sounds. At first, his mind tried to make sense of the noise. Were they fireworks? Something from a nearby fire pit? He saw what he later described as a flash of light. 5 shots total, he thought. Though in the confusion of being suddenly woken, he couldn't be certain. At a nearby campsite, Stacy Seibern was also startled awake by the gunfire. The sounds were unmistakable to her, like shots from a shotgun or rifle. She felt a spike of fear. Where was the shooter? Was she in danger? She reached for her phone and called 911, speaking quietly because she didn't know if the person firing shots could hear her or see her tent. Scott heard one of Tristan's daughters begin to cry. He waited, expecting Tristan to comfort the child as any father would. But the crying continued. Then he heard the older sister talking with her younger sibling. Still, Tristan didn't respond. The younger daughter kept saying something. Wet, wet, Scott heard her repeat. At first he didn't think much of it. Maybe she'd had an accident or spilled water, but the distress in the children's voices grew. The crying became more insistent. Scott got out of his tent and approached Tristan's tent. What he saw would haunt him forever. The two little girls were kneeling beside their father. They were trying to wake him up, calling for Daddy. Daddy, 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 the older girl cried, her voice carrying that mournful, desperate quality that only a child's grief can produce. The younger daughter's leggings were covered in blood, her father's blood from kneeling next to him. Scott called out to his brother-in-law, but got no response. He held on to the girls, trying to comfort them, his own mind struggling to process what was happening. Other campers began to emerge. Drawn by the commotion, once Scott had help with the children, he went back into the tent to check on Tristan. He noticed a small hole in the tent's fabric. Then he looked at Tristan's face. I noticed there was nothing in his eyes. Scott would later testify in court. In that moment, he understood. I realized he was gone, and I left. A single bullet from a high-powered rifle had pierced the tent and struck Tristan Baudet in the head as he slept. Death would have been nearly instantaneous. He never woke, he never knew what happened. His two daughters sleeping beside him were physically unharmed, but would carry the trauma of that morning for the rest of their lives. By the time sheriff's deputies arrived, there was nothing to be done. Tristan Baudet, 35 years old, a talented scientist, a devoted husband and father, a man who loved nature and lived with kindness, was dead. The murder sent shockwaves through the community. A man camping with his young children, shot in his sleep for no apparent reason. It seemed incomprehensible. News of Tristan's death spread quickly, and with it came the revelation that authorities had known about previous shootings in the area, but had never warned the public. People were outraged. Why hadn't they been told? How many families had camped at Malibu Creek State Park in the preceding months, completely unaware that someone had been taking shots at people? The park was shut down immediately after Tristan's murder. It would remain closed to camping for nearly a year. Erica Wu, Tristan's widow, was left to grapple with unimaginable loss. She released a statement describing Tristan as a devoted husband and father, whose life revolved around his family. We met when we were teenagers, grew up together, married and had two amazing and beautiful daughters, she said. In everything that he did, Tristan was kind, selfless, and giving, and had a natural ability to connect with just about anyone. A GoFundMe account established to support Erica and the girls raised over $100,000 as the community rallied around the grieving family. But grief demanded answers. Who had done this? And why? The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department now faced immense pressure to solve the case. They publicly acknowledged that there had been at least 7 other unsolved shootings in the area, dating back to November of 2016. Suddenly, what had seemed like isolated incidents took on a more sinister pattern. Investigators began working the case intensively. They looked at ballistics evidence. They examined the bullet that had killed Tristan. They revisited all the previous shooting incidents, looking for connections. They analyzed forensic evidence from the campsite. They followed up on tips from the public. And they began to develop a theory. The shooter wasn't someone targeting specific individuals. This wasn't about Tristan Baudet personally. The attacks appeared random, which in some ways made them even more terrifying. Someone was stalking the park and its surroundings, shooting at people for no apparent reason. The profile that emerged was of someone who lived in or near the park, someone comfortable in the wilderness, someone who moved through the mountains like a ghost. The attacks typically occurred in the pre-dawn hours, when darkness provided cover and victims were most vulnerable, deep in sleep. Throughout the summer of 2018, as investigators worked the case, other crimes began occurring in the area. Commercial burglaries at local facilities, the Calabasas Community Center, broken into twice. The Las Virgenes Water District, also targeted twice. The pattern in these burglaries was unusual. Food was the primary target. Vending machines were smashed open, supplies taken. Whoever was responsible seemed to be living off stolen provisions. Then in October of 2018, Nearly 4 months after Tristan's murder, authorities spotted someone suspicious on a ridge atop near the park. The man was carrying a backpack. When deputies approached and eventually detained him, they made several crucial discoveries. The man had a rifle in his backpack. He also had 2 loaded magazines and ammunition. His boots matched prints found at some of the burglary scenes. A scent dog was able to track his path back to a makeshift encampment in a ravine about 1.5 miles north of Mulholland Highway west of Las Virgenes Road in the Malibu Canyon area. The man's name was Anthony Rada. He was 42 years old, and according to authorities, he was a survivalist who had been living in the Santa Monica Mountains, often sleeping outside, sustaining himself through burglaries and stolen food. Anthony Rada was not an unknown quantity to law enforcement. He had a criminal history that included previous time in state prison for possessing explosives and for possessing a loaded gun, which was illegal for someone with felony convictions. At the time of his arrest in October 2018, he was on probation. Rada's arrest in connection with the burglaries was just the beginning. As investigators examined the rifle found in his possession, they conducted ballistics testing. The results were damning. The weapon matched the bullet that had killed Tristan Baudet. It also matched a shooting that damaged the white Tesla 4 days before Tristan's murder. By January of 2019, prosecutors felt they had enough evidence. A grand jury was convened, and in November of 2019, Anthony Rada was formally indicted on an extensive list of charges. 1 count of murder for killing Tristan Baudet, 10 counts of attempted murder for the various shooting incidents, and 5 counts of second-degree commercial burglary for the break-ins at local facilities. The attempted murder charges included counts for Tristan's 2 daughters, who prosecutors argued had been placed in mortal danger even though they hadn't been physically harmed. The other attempted murder charges related to previous shooting victims, including the man wounded while sleeping in a hammock in November 2016, and various motorists whose vehicles had been shot at. But building a case and proving it in court are 2 different challenges. Rada pleaded not guilty to all charges. His defense attorney would argue that the evidence against his client was weak, circumstantial, full of gaps. The case was delayed multiple times. Rada proved to be a difficult defendant. He attacked sheriff's deputies while in custody on at least 2 occasions, requiring him to be restrained during court appearances. By the time his trial finally began in May of 2023, nearly 5 years after Tristan's death, Rada had waived his right to be present in the courtroom. He refused to attend his own trial. The trial opened on Friday, May 5th, 2023, in downtown Los Angeles. For Erica Wu, now raising her daughters alone for nearly 5 years, it was a chance to finally see some form of justice for Tristan. She attended the proceedings with a large support group, knowing she would have to relive the trauma of that morning. Deputy District Attorney Antonella Nestorescu laid out the prosecution's case. The evidence, she told the jury, was overwhelming. Prosecutors traced Rada's movements through digital and physical evidence. His phone had connected to the park's Wi-Fi network regularly. Boot prints found at crime scenes matched his boots. The rifle in his possession when arrested was ballistically linked to Tristan's murder and the Tesla shooting. Nestorescu painted a picture of a deliberate predator. The evidence shows a pattern of stalking and preying on campers, she told the jury. Rada had terrorized the area since November 2016. The victims were shot during the pre-dawn hours, a time when people are usually in their deepest, most peaceful sleep. He wore a mask and dark clothing, moved carefully and deliberately, always carrying his rifle. When Rada committed the burglaries after Tristan's murder, he was thorough and careful. The prosecutor said, security footage from one business appeared to show him carrying a rifle similar to the one found during his arrest. After the last break-in, investigators tracked him through the wilderness using boot prints and a scent dog until they found his encampment. The defendant managed to do what he had persistently tried to do since 2016 when he killed Baudet, Nestorescu told the jury. Tristan was sleeping next to his daughters when he was shot. His youngest daughter's leggings were covered in her father's blood when she knelt beside him.
The testimony was devastating. Stacy Saborn, who had camped nearby, described being awakened by gunshots and hearing a man calling for help and a baby crying. It was a very mournful cry for daddy over and over again.
she testified. "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy." Scott McCurdy recounted checking on his brother-in-law and seeing nothing in Tristan's eyes, realizing he was gone. He described the small hole in the tent, the toys scattered around the campsite, the children's bike on top of one of the vehicles, all the small details that spoke of interrupted innocence. But Rada's defense attorney, Nicholas Okorocha, pushed back against the prosecution's narrative. He urged jurors to look for reasonable doubt, to watch for the absence of evidence that would indicate gaps in the case. One piece of evidence that the defense highlighted was DNA testing performed on cigarette butts, found near where authorities believed the shooter had positioned himself. The DNA from those cigarette butts came from an unidentified male and did not match Anthony Rada. The defense argued this proved someone else had been at the scene. The investigation had been going on for 4.5 years, Okorocha noted, and authorities still couldn't identify whose DNA was on those cigarette butts. In her rebuttal, Ms. Dureski dismissed the cigarette butt discussion as a red herring. They were found in a public campground, she pointed out. Anyone could have discarded them there at any time. Completely unrelated to the shooting. The defense also questioned whether Rada's phone being connected to the park's Wi-Fi proved he was physically present at specific times. Many people connected to that Wi-Fi, the defense argued. Regular connection didn't equal presence during the crimes. But the prosecution had more than circumstantial evidence. They had ballistics. They had the rifle. They had the pattern of behavior. They had Rada living in the mountains, stealing food, moving through the area like someone intimately familiar with the terrain. After hearing all the evidence and arguments, the jury began deliberations on Tuesday, May 23, 2023. On Friday, May 26, 2023, the jury returned with their verdict. Erica Wu sat in the courtroom, surrounded by family and friends, bracing herself for whatever was to come. The jury found Anthony Rada guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Tristan Baudet. It wasn't the first-degree murder conviction that prosecutors had sought, which would have required proof of premeditation and deliberation. But it was murder nonetheless, a conviction that recognized Rada had intentionally and unlawfully killed Tristan. The jury also convicted Rada of 3 counts of attempted murder. 2 counts for Tristan's daughters, who had been sleeping beside him and whom the jury determined had been placed in mortal danger, and 1 count for shooting at the Tesla driver 4 days before Tristan's death. Notably, however, the jury ruled that Rada had not acted willfully to kill the daughters or with premeditation regarding them. He was acquitted of 7 other attempted murder charges related to the earlier shooting incidents. Perhaps the jury felt the evidence linking Rada to those specific incidents wasn't strong enough. Despite the pattern they suggested, we'll never know their exact reasoning, as jury deliberations are confidential, but the jury did find Rada guilty on all 5 counts of second-degree commercial burglary, the break-ins at the Calabasas Community Center, and the Las Virgenes Water District. As the verdicts were read, Erica Wu wept. 5 years of waiting, of raising 2 daughters who would never fully remember their father, of dealing with trauma and loss in the slow grind of the justice system, had led to this moment. Rada himself was not in the courtroom to hear the verdicts. He had waived his right to be present, and so the words were spoken in his absence. Sentencing was scheduled for June 7th, 2023. This time Anthony Rada was present, though not by choice and not in a conventional manner. He was wheeled into the downtown Los Angeles courtroom in a restraining chair, wearing glasses and a black mesh spit hood over his head to prevent him from spitting on court personnel or deputies. His history of violence while in custody had led to these extraordinary security measures. Judge Eleanor J. Hunter, who had presided over the trial, addressed the courtroom. She called the case chilling. Anthony Rada, she said, was not only cold-blooded but also smart, a dangerous combination. She called him the poster boy for posing a danger to the community. Initially, Judge Hunter announced a sentence of 142 years to life in prison. But after meeting with attorneys, she reconvened the hearing and acknowledged she had made an error in calculating the sentence. The corrected sentence was 119 years to life. Let that sink in for a moment. 119 years to life. 40 years to life for the murder of Tristan Baudet. An additional 79 years to life for the burglaries and attempted murders. At 46 years old, Anthony Rada would almost certainly spend the remainder of his life behind bars. During the sentencing, the prosecution and defense presented their arguments. Ms. Dureski reminded the court of the terror Rada had inflicted on the community, the randomness of his attacks, the fact that he had managed to kill after nearly 2 years of trying. She spoke of the youngest daughter's leggings covered in her father's blood, of the mournful cries of children who didn't understand why Daddy wouldn't wake up. Rada's attorney, Nicholas Okorocha, declined to comment extensively on the sentencing, but said he appreciated the deeply moving victim impact statement delivered by Erica Wu. What she said in that statement wasn't reported in detail by the media, preserving some privacy for her grief. But one can imagine a widow speaking about a man she'd known since they were teenagers, a father who would never see his daughters grow up, a scientist whose potential contributions to the world were stolen by a random act of violence. The sentencing didn't end all legal matters related to the case. Erica Wu had filed a lawsuit against the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, California State Parks, and other agencies, seeking at least $90 million in damages. Her claims centered on the allegation that these agencies had negligently failed to warn the public about the shootings, that they had known about at least 7 unsolved shootings in Malibu Creek State Park, but kept that information from the people who visited. Lieutenant James Royal's lawsuit against the county also proceeded, claiming he had been retaliated against for trying to warn the public, and that the department's silence had allowed further harm to occur. These civil cases spoke to larger questions about institutional responsibility, about what authorities owe to the public when they know about ongoing dangers. Should the park have been closed earlier? Should visitors have been warned? Would Tristan Beaudet still be alive if people had known there was a pattern of random shootings in the area? We can never know the answer to that last question. Perhaps Tristan would have chosen to camp elsewhere. Perhaps he would have decided the risk was worth it for the experience he wanted to give his daughters. Perhaps the warnings would have prompted increased law enforcement presence that might have prevented the shooting. What we do know is that Tristan Beaudet went camping on June 22nd, 2018, without any knowledge that he was putting himself and his children in danger. That information was withheld from him and from every other person who visited the park during those months when the shootings were occurring. Malibu Creek State Park eventually reopened to campers in May of 2019, nearly a year after Tristan's murder. Life, as it always does, continued. People returned to hike the trails, to wade in the rock pool, to photograph the volcanic rock formations. The MASH site remained a popular destination. The beauty of the Santa Monica Mountains persisted, indifferent to human tragedy. But for Tristan's family, life could never return to what it was. His daughters, who were now growing up without him, would only have fragments of memory from when they were 2 and 4 years old. Photographs would have to stand in for the father they'd lost. Stories from family members would have to fill in the gaps of who he was. Erica Wu continued her work as a physician, raising her daughters as a single mother, carrying grief that would never fully heal. The scientific community lost a researcher who might have made further breakthroughs in drug delivery systems, in vaccine technology, in pharmaceutical development. We'll never know what Tristan Beaudet might have accomplished with a full life. His friends remembered him as the greatest friend you could ask for, a talented scientist, an amazing father to his beautiful daughters, and a devoted, loving husband. They remembered his genuine kindness, his natural ability to connect with people. They treasured the memories of annual hiking trips, of beers shared, of conversations about science and life and everything in between. The case of Anthony Rada and the murder of Tristan Beaudet raises uncomfortable questions that extend beyond one man's actions. How do we balance public safety with not wanting to cause panic? When authorities know about a pattern of dangerous incidents, what is their obligation to warn people? How do we prevent random violence when the perpetrator blends into the landscape, living off the grid, moving through wilderness areas that span thousands of acres? There are no easy answers. Rada was described as a survivalist, someone who chose to live outside of conventional society. He sustained himself through theft, moved through the mountains with apparent expertise, and for nearly 2 years managed to evade capture despite multiple shooting incidents, even after he killed Tristan Beaudet. It took investigators 4 more months to arrest him, and only then because his pattern of burglaries eventually led them to his encampment. The prosecution argued that Rada had a pattern of stalking and preying on campers, that he had persistently tried to kill someone since November 2016, and finally succeeded in June 2018. Whether he had a specific motive beyond the act itself remains unclear. Mental illness, anger at society, the isolation of living alone in the wilderness for extended periods, Any or all of these factors might have played a role. But Rhoda never testified. He chose not to be present for most of his trial. His internal reasoning remains largely a mystery. What is not a mystery is the impact of his actions. A man is dead. 2 children grew up without their father. A wife lost her husband. Parents lost their son. The community lost a talented scientist and kind person. And beyond this one family, countless other people who visited Malibu Creek State Park during those months were unknowingly put at risk. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps we can take a moment to remember Tristan Baudet. Not as a victim, but as he lived. Picture a young man who worked hard enough to become valedictorian, who pursued knowledge not for ego, but because he genuinely wanted to make the world better. Imagine him in a laboratory at Berkeley, collaborating with immunologists and biologists, all of them working together to develop safer vaccines, to find better ways to deliver life-saving medications. Envision him as a father, teaching his daughters to ride bikes, reading them bedtime stories, making them laugh, showing them through his actions what kindness and devotion look like. Think of him with Erica, the woman he'd known since they were teenagers, building a life together, supporting each other's careers, creating a family filled with love. This is how Tristan Baudet should be remembered. Not for how he died, but for how he lived. With dedication, with kindness, with love, with an appreciation for both the complexities of science and the simple beauty of nature. As a devoted husband and father, as a talented scientist, as a good friend, as a good man. His death was a tragedy that should never have happened. The failure to warn the public about the pattern of shootings was a systemic failure with devastating consequences. But Tristan's life, the 35 years he spent on this earth, had meaning and value that transcends the circumstances of his death. He contributed to pharmaceutical science. He loved his family deeply. He was kind to the people around him. He sought out beauty in the natural world. These things matter. These things last beyond physical death. And so, as you close your eyes and let sleep come, hold on to that thought. Life is precious and fragile. We never know which moment might be our last. What matters is how we spend the time we're given. Do we work towards something meaningful? Do we treat others with kindness? Do we make time for the people we love? Do we appreciate the beauty around us? Tristan Baudet did all of these things. In that way, his life was a success, even though it was cut tragically short. Let this story settle in your mind. Tomorrow will come with its own concerns and joys. But for tonight, simply breathe. Remember that even in the darkest stories, there is light in the lives people live and the love they share. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.